The brass door knocker struck 3 times before the butler answered. Lord William George, 5th Earl of Addington, stood on the marble steps of the Ashworth mansion, with rain dripping from his hat brim. Behind him, his valet, Reeves, held 2 worn leather cases, everything they owned that had been sold to creditors or left in England as collateral. The butler's face went slack when George handed him the calling card. "Lord George, to see Miss Claudia Ashworth," George said. "We're expected." The butler looked at the card, then at George's mud-splattered boots, then past him to the hired carriage pulling away down Beacon Street. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Perhaps you should speak with Mr. Ashworth, my lord." George's jaw tightened, the only movement in his face. He'd crossed an ocean in steerage, sat 3 days in New York waiting for a train north, and ridden through a spring storm that turned his second-best coat into a soggy rag. The butler's tone said everything before words could ruin it. "I'll speak with whoever's available," George said. The butler stepped back. George entered, Reeves a shadow behind him, and they stood in a foyer that could swallow his family's portrait gallery twice over. Gaslight flickered in crystal sconces. A staircase curved upward like a question mark. Oil paintings lined the walls, ships and senators, and stern-faced men who made their fortunes in textiles or railroads or things. George's father would VA called trade with the sniff. George's father had been dead 3 years. The sniffing hadn't saved them. Mr. Ashworth appeared from a side door, his vest straining across his middle, his face red as boiled ham. He stopped when he saw George. His hand went to his watch chain and stayed there. "Lord George," Ashworth said. "Mr. Ashworth." George removed his hat. Water pooled on the marble. "I apologize for my appearance. The roads from the station, Claudia's gone." The words hung in the foyer like smoke. George heard Reeves shift behind him, the leather cases creaking. Outside, rain hammered the windows. A clock somewhere struck 4. "Gone," George said. "Left yesterday morning." Ashworth's hand dropped from the watch chain. He looked at George the way men look at broken things they'd paid good money for. "Took the westbound train with that Chen girl. Left this." He held out an envelope, cream-colored paper, George's name in a woman's careful hand. The wax seal was broken. Ashworth had read it first. George took it. The paper was thick, expensive. He opened it while Ashworth watched, his boots squeaking on the wet marble. "Lord George, I will not be purchased like a mare at auction, no matter how fine the buyer's pedigree. You need funds. I need freedom from a father who thinks daughters are a currency. We both lose if I stay. My apologies for the wasted journey." "See?" George folded the letter once, twice, creasing it with his thumbnail. He looked up. Ashworth was studying him the way George's creditors had studied the furniture at Addington Hall, calculating value, judging what could be salvaged. "My daughter is headstrong," Ashworth said. "Her mother was too. God rest her. Claudia got ideas from those damned dime novels she reads. Buffalo Bill and Calamity Jane." "And where did she go?" George asked. Ashworth blinked. "West. I told you. The train west." "Where west?" "Chicago, I expect. Maybe St. Louis. She's got her mother's jewelry, enough money to cause trouble." Ashworth's face went redder. "You'll want to return to England, I suppose." "I'll cover your passage, naturally. The arrangement is still in place," George said. Ashworth stopped talking. In the silence, the clock struck the quarter hour. Reeves coughed softly. "My lord," Reeves said. "Perhaps we should book passage west," George said. He didn't look at his valet. "Whatever train leaves soonest. 2 tickets, second class." "Now see here," Ashworth said. "Claudia's made her choice. She's 24 years old and stubborn as a mule. You chase her west, she'd just run further. Girl's got romantic notions about the frontier, thinks it's all cowboys and adventure. She'll come home when the money runs out or the reality sets in." George put his hat back on. Water dripped from the brim onto Ashworth's marble floor, making small dark circles. "My father lost our estate through romantic notions," George said. "He died believing honor mattered more than ledgers. I spent 3 years watching creditors catalog our paintings and furniture and land. My mother," he stopped, started again. "My mother sits in one wing of Addington Hall because that's all we can afford to heat. She eats whatever cook can make from what the kitchen garden provides. She wears dresses from before I was born because we sold everything else." Ashworth's mouth worked but nothing came out. "I gave my word," George said. "I'll find your daughter. I'll fulfill the arrangement, and I'll save my family's name." He turned toward the door. Reeves grabbed the cases and followed. "You're a damned fool," Ashworth called after them. George stopped, his hand on the door handle. He looked back over his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "My father was too." But he never broke his word. Outside, the rain had stopped. Steam rose from the street. George stood on the steps and looked at Boston spreading before him, brick buildings and church spires, and beyond them, somewhere past the horizon, a train carrying Claudia Ashworth west into country he'd only read about in books. Reeves set the cases down. "My lord," he said, "we have $47 between us." I know what Chicago is, George said. A carriage clattered past, splashing through puddles. George watched it disappear around the corner. He pulled Claudia's letter from his pocket and read it again. We both lose if I stay. The handwriting was confident, each letter formed with precision. This wasn't the scrawl of someone frightened or uncertain. This was someone who'd made a choice and meant to keep it. Reeves, George, said. My lord, have you ever tracked game? Pheasant and deer, my lord. On your father's estate, before this won't be different, George said. Just longer distance. Reeves picked up the cases. And if we find her and she refuses to return? George looked at his valet. Reeves had been with the family since George was 12, had fought Zulus at Rorke's Drift, come home with a limp and a scar, and watched the estate crumble around them. He'd stood at George's father's funeral and had flinched when George told him there was no money for wages. Just stayed on, quiet and steady, because some men understood duty the way others understood breathing. Then we'll have tried, George said. He descended the steps. Behind them, the Ashworth mansion rose like a monument to everything George's father had failed to build new money. American money, money that didn't care about titles or honor or anything except what it could buy. George needed that money. His mother needed it. Addington Hall needed it. Claudia Ashworth pressed her forehead against the train window and watched Massachusetts blur into memory. The glass was cold. Outside, telegraph poles flicked past like matchsticks. Fields rolled toward horizons she'd only seen in paintings. And somewhere behind them, hours behind now, she hoped Boston was waking to the scandal she'd left in her wake. You're crying, Sarah Chen said. Claudia touched her cheek. Her glove came away damp. I'm not. Your face is leaking water. What do you call that? Condensation. Claudia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. From the window, Sarah set down her books and botanical text her father had sent from San Francisco. Thick as a Bible and twice as dull. She leaned across the narrow space between their seats. The second-class car rattled around them, half empty, this early in the morning. An old woman, 3 rows up, snored. A drummer with a sample case sprawled across from them, dead to the world. We can still go back, Sarah said. No, your father will forgive you. Mine has forgiven worse. Has he forgiven you for existing? Claudia asked. Sarah's smile went tight at the corners. She had her mother's eyes almond-shaped, dark as river stones, and her father's English cheekbones. Railroad money bought a lot of things, but it didn't buy acceptance in Boston parlors. Sarah Chen was too Chinese for the Americans and too American for the Chinese, which made her perfect for Claudia, who'd always been too much of everything herself. Point taken, Sarah said. She picked up her book again, then set it down. But your father isn't sending you to marry an English lord you've never met. He is. He did. That's why we're on this train. And what happens when we reach Chicago? Claudia pulled an envelope from her reticule. The paper was wrinkled from handling. The ink smudged where her palm had rested. She'd written it 3 times, once angry, once apologetic. Once with the cold precision her father used in his business letters. The third version was the one she'd left. I told him I wouldn't be purchased, Claudia said, that Lord George, whoever he is, needs our money, and I need freedom from being bartered like livestock. You used those words. Purchased and bartered. And livestock, and auction. Sarah whistled low. Your father must have turned purple. I don't care what color he turned. Claudia folded the envelope. Unfolded it. Her hands needed work, or they'd shake. I left before dawn, took mother's jewelry, the pieces she left me, not the ones father gave her. Enough to live on for months, if I'm careful. By the time father reads that letter, we'll be halfway to Chicago. The train whistle shrieked. They plunged into a tunnel, and the world went black except for the oil lamps swaying in their brackets. Claudia's reflection stared back at her from the dark window-pale face. Brown hair coming loose from its pins, 24 years old and running like a thief. They burst into daylight. Hills rose on either side, still patched with late spring snow. What's in Chicago? Sarah asked. I don't know. After Chicago. St. Louis, maybe. Then Santa Fe. I read about it in Harper's Weekly. Adobe buildings and mountains and sky that goes on forever. You read about it, Sarah said, in a magazine. In Boston, while sitting in your father's parlor. Claudia turned from the window. What's your point? My point is that magazines lie. My mother told me about the camps where they built the railroads. Chinese men dying in snow or heat, paid half what white men got. Buried in graves nobody marked. Harper's Weekly didn't write about that. They wrote about progress and civilization and golden spikes. This is different. How? Claudia opened her mouth, closed it. Through the window, a farmhouse slid past, white clapboard, red barn, chickens scratching in the yard. A woman stood in the doorway holding a baby, watching the train pass. For a moment, their eyes met. Then the farmhouse was gone. I don't know how it's different, Claudia said. I just know I couldn't marry a man I've never met because my father needs to move money around like chess pieces. I couldn't sit in parlors for the rest of my life drinking tea and pretending I don't have thoughts of my own. You could have said no, stayed home. refused, and then what? He'd cut off my allowance. I'd live in his house, on his sufferance, getting older and more unmarriageable by the year, until I became the spinster daughter who runs church socials and tends to nieces and nephews. I've seen it happen. That's not living. That's waiting to die. Sarah pulled a sandwich from her bag, bread and cheese, wrapped in brown paper. She broke it in half and offered Claudia a piece. They ate in silence while the train clattered west. You know he'll send someone after you, Sarah said. Father, he's too busy. Too much pride to admit his daughter ran. Not your father, the Englishman. What was his name? Lord William George, 5th Earl of something. Addington. I didn't pay attention. Men like that don't give up easy. Not when money's involved. Claudia crumpled the paper, wrapping into a ball. Let him come. By the time he figures out I'm gone, we'll be in Chicago. By the time he reaches Chicago, we'll be in St. Louis. He'll give up. Go home. Tell father the arrangement fell through. And if he doesn't give up, the old woman 3 rows up, snorted and woke herself, blinking around the car like she'd forgotten where she was. The drummer shifted in his sleep, his sample case sliding toward the floor. Outside, the landscape was opening up, fewer trees. More sky, land that looked like it went on forever in shades of brown and green. Claudia folded her hands in her lap. Then he's a fool. And I'll tell him so to his face. Sarah smiled. I'd pay to see that. You won't have to. You'll be right there beside me. Wouldn't miss it. Sarah opened her botanical text, found her place, settled in, like she planned to read, until Chicago. Then she looked up. Claudia, yes. Your father's letter, the one you left, did you sign it with your full name? Of course. Claudia Ashworth. Not Miss Claudia Ashworth. Not daughter of just my name. Claudia frowned. Why? Sarah tapped the book's cover. Because when you sign just your name, no title, no relation, that's how men sign letters. That's how my father signs letters to his business partners. Like equals. Claudia turned back to the window. Her reflection stared back, clearer now in the morning light. Same face, same brown hair, but something in the eyes looked different, harder, maybe, or just more awake. Good, she said. The train whistle blew again, long and mournful. They rattled over a bridge, water rushing beneath them, dark and fast and cold. Claudia watched it disappear behind them and didn't look back. In Boston, her father would be reading the letter now. In England, wherever England was from here. Across an ocean, she'd never seen Lord William. George probably didn't even know she existed yet. Probably still thought he was coming to Boston to marry a grateful girl who'd trade her freedom for a title. Let him come. Let him cross the ocean and knock on her father's door and find nothing but an empty parlor and a letter that said no. She pressed her hand against the window. The glass hummed with the train's rhythm, forward, 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 away from everything she'd known and toward something she couldn't name yet. Sarah, she said, thank you for coming with me. Sarah didn't look up from her book. Thank you for asking. My father's house was getting boring. They smiled at each other. The train carried them west into morning, 2 women running from different things toward the same uncertain future. Behind them, the sun rose over Boston. Ahead, Chicago waited, stockyards and smoke, a city that ate men whole and spit them out changed. Claudia smoothed her skirt and watched America scroll past her window. Wild and huge, and nothing like the magazines had promised. 3 months earlier, England George stood in the portrait gallery while Mr. Whitmore counted his ancestors. The 4th Earl, Whitmore said, pointing with his pencil at a gilt frame the size of a doorway. Painted by Reynolds, I believe. That's £2,000 at auction. Perhaps more if we find the right buyer. George's hands stayed clasped behind his back. The March wind rattled the windows. Rain streaked the glass, turning the parkland outside into gray smears. The 3rd Earl and his family, Whitmore, moved to the next painting. Pencil scratched paper. Gainsborough, call it 3,000. The 2nd Earl is that enough? Hard to tell in this light. Your father really should have maintained the gas lines to this wing. My father was dead, George said. Whitmore looked up from his ledger. He was 40, thin as a knife blade, with spectacles that caught the dim light and hid his eyes. He arrived at dawn with 2 assistants and a lockbox full of documents, liens and notes and debts going back 10 years. Quite right, Lord George. My apologies. He turned back to the paintings. Still, these should fetch a good price. The frames alone are worth. You're not taking the portraits. The pencil stopped moving. In the silence, George heard rain tapping the windows. Floorboards creaking in the empty hall. His mother's voice somewhere distant, giving instructions to cook about dinner what could be made from turnips and yesterday's bread. Lord George, Whitmore said. He closed the ledger with a soft snap. I understand this is difficult, but your father's debts amount to £47,000. The estate's annual income, such as it is, covers perhaps £2,000. That leaves £45,000 owing to various creditors, myself included. I'm aware of the mathematics. Then you understand we must liquidate assets. The paintings, the furniture, the silverette, all must go. We've already sold the London house, the Yorkshire property, and the stable of horses. What remains barely scratches the surface of what's owed. George walked to the window. Below, the formal gardens his great-grandfather had commissioned ran wild. Hedges grew shaggy. Gravel paths disappeared under weeds. The fountain stood dry, its marble nymphs stained green with moss. Beyond the gardens, tenant farms stretched toward the village, fewer now than when George was a boy. His father had sold 5 farms before he died, then 3 more got seized. My father made investments, George said. Your father was a romantic. Romantics make poor businessmen. George turned. Careful, Mr. Whitmore. I mean no disrespect to the dead. I'm stating facts. Whitmore opened the ledger again, flipped pages. Railway speculation in South America. Mining ventures in Wales that produced more debt than Orty. He loaned money to friends who never repaid him. He believed in honor and handshakes, while other men believed in contracts and collateral. He kept his word. He kept his word and lost his fortune. You'll forgive me for noting that history favors the solvent. A door opened at the far end of the gallery. George's mother appeared, small and straight-backed in a dress that had been fashionable when George was at university. Her hair was white now, pulled back severe. She carried herself like she still commanded a household staff of 30, instead of the 5 servants who remained cuckoo maids, Reeves, and old Davies who tended what was left of the gardens. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Whitmore bowed. Lady Addington, I trust you're finding everything in order. I'm cataloging assets, my lady, for the creditors. I see. She crossed to stand beside George at the window. Her hand touched his arm, light as a bird landing. And the portraits, surely those must remain with the estate. I'm afraid not, my lady. They're assets like any other. Their family, their pigment and canvas. Valuable pigment and canvas, but pigment and canvas nonetheless. George felt his mother's hand tighten on his arm. Her face stayed smooth, pleasant, the mask she'd worn since his father's funeral when half of London came to pay respects and the other half stayed away because they knew the estate was ruined. Mr. Whitmore, George said, a moment alone with my mother. Please. Whitmore looked at his pocket watch. The inventory can wait 10 minutes. Whitmore snapped the watch closed. He tucked the ledger under his arm and walked toward the door, his shoes clicking on the parquet floor. At the threshold he paused. 10 minutes, Lord George. I have 3 other estates to visit this week, all in similar circumstances. Financial ruin is becoming quite fashionable. He left, the door closed. George's mother moved to the nearest painting, the 4th Earl. George's great-great-grandfather, standing beside a horse with Addington Hall rising behind him. The artist had painted it on a summer day, all golden light and green fields, everything perfect. He rode that horse at Waterloo, she said. Came home with a saber scar and a French officer's sword. It's still in the library. Was still in the library. I suppose they've inventoried that too. Mother, your father loved this house. Did you know that? When he inherited it, he walked every room, every corridor, memorizing it like poetry. He said we were custodians, not owners. That we held Addington Hall in trust for you, and you'd hold it for your children, on and on forever. She touched the frame. He really believed that. He was wrong. He was optimistic. There's a difference. George joined her at the painting. Up close, he could see the cracks in the varnish, the places where age had darkened the oils. Even the perfect past got old. I spoke with Whitmore last week, his mother said. Before you returned from London, he laid out our options. We can sell everything, pay the creditors, and perhaps keep enough to rent rooms somewhere. Cheltenham maybe, or Bath, somewhere genteel and cheap. No, or we can declare bankruptcy, surrender the estate, and start fresh with nothing. Also, no. She turned to face him. Then what, William? What brilliant plan have you devised that I haven't seen? He pulled a letter from his coat pocket. American paper, thick and creamy, the kind that cost money. The seal showed a ship in full sail. This arrived last week, from a lawyer in Boston representing Mr. Harold Ashworth. He has a daughter, Claudia, aged 24, educated, unmarried. Mr. Ashworth has built a textile empire and seeks to ally his fortune with an established title. His mother took the letter. She read it once, quickly, then again slower. An American, she said, an American with $2 million. Marriage for money. Your father would be horrified. My father left us £47,000 in debt and a house we couldn't afford to heat. I think his horror is spent. His mother folded the letter. And the girl, what does she want? According to the lawyer, she wants what her father wants. The match has been discussed. Discussed, not agreed. The lawyer seemed confident. Lawyers always seem confident. It's how they justify their fees. She handed the letter back. You've never met her. No, she could be dreadful, ignorant, cruel. She could be perfect. It doesn't matter. If I marry her, Mr. Ashworth settles £50,000 on us immediately. The debts are paid. Addington Hall is saved. You can stay here instead of Bath, and you'll have a wife you don't love. George crossed to the window again. Outside, the rain had stopped. Clouds broke apart, letting through pale English sun that lit the wild gardens and the ruined fountain and the parkland beyond. Love is for people who can afford it, he said. Behind him, his mother was silent. Then she sighed, a sound like air escaping from somewhere deep. You're so much like your father, she said, and nothing like him at all. I take that as a compliment. It wasn't meant as one. She came to stand beside him. If you do this, if you cross an ocean and marry a stranger to save a pile of stones and timber, what happens to you? I survive. We survive. That's not the same as living. It's close enough. She touched his cheek, turned his face toward her. Her eyes were gray, like his father's had been, like every portrait in the gallery that Whitmore wanted to sell. Your father died believing honor mattered more than money, she said. He was wrong. But at least he died believing something. What will you believe in? But I kept my word. That I saved what he couldn't, that the name Addington still means something when I'm done, and if it doesn't, if you cross an ocean and the American girl refuses, if you sacrifice everything and it's still not enough. George looked at her. Then I'll have tried. The door opened. Whitmore entered with his assistants, 2 young men with ledgers and measuring tapes, ready to reduce the 4th Earl and all his ancestors to pounds and shillings. Lord George, Whitmore said, we really must continue. One moment. George turned to his mother. Will you be all right? While I'm gone, I'm always all right. It's my particular talent. She squeezed his hand. When do you leave? Tomorrow. There's a ship from Southampton. Tomorrow, she smiled, tight and sad. Not much time for goodbyes. I hate goodbyes. So did your father. Perhaps you're more like him than I thought. She left. George watched her walk down the gallery, past the portraits of all his ancestors who'd married for love or duty or political alliance. Men and women who debuilt Addington Hall and filled it with children and somehow kept the whole enterprise running for 300 years. Until his father had taken his turn and failed. George wouldn't fail. He couldn't afford to. Mr. Whitmore, he said, the paintings stay until I return. Lord George, I really must insist. I'll have the money in 3 months. American money. You'll get what you're owed, with interest, but the portraits stay. Whitmore studied him over his spectacles. And if you don't return with the money, then you can have everything. The paintings, the house, the land, all of it. But give me 3 months. That's highly irregular, so is allowing a peer of the realm to keep his ancestral home. We're all improvising, Mr. Whitmore. I'm simply asking for time. Whitmore looked at his assistants. They shrugged. He sighed and opened his ledger again. 3 months, he said, not a day more. If you're not back with £50,000 by June, this all goes to auction. Agreed. George left them to their counting. He walked through the cold house to his rooms, where Reeves was packing the last of their things to suits, 3 shirts, 1 pair of good boots, everything else, sold or pawned. Reeves, George said, my lord, have you ever been to America? No, my lord, neither have I. It should be educational. Reeves folded a shirt with precise creases. Will we be gone long? 3 months, perhaps less, if we're lucky. And if we're unlucky, George looked around his room, the bed he'd slept in since childhood, the desk where he'd learned Latin and Greek, the window that looked out over the same view his father and grandfather had seen. All of it mortgaged, catalogued, 1 step from the auction block. Then we'll improvise, George said. They finished packing in silence. Outside, clouds covered the sun again. The wild gardens disappeared into gray. The Boston train station smelled like coal smoke and wet wool. Reeves set their cases on the platform and watched his lord negotiate with the ticket agent. George stood straight-backed at the brass window, his accent drawing stares from the crowd pushing past laborers with lunch pails, women with market baskets, a gang of boys selling newspapers at a penny each. Chicago, George said, 2 tickets, 2nd class, earliest departure. The agent was fat and bored. He didn't look up from his ledger. Next train's at 6 tomorrow morning. That'll be $8 each way. We'll take them. $16. You got $16. Lord. George counted bills onto the counter. The agent watched, then counted them again himself, lips moving. He stamped 2 tickets and shoved them across. Platform 3. Train leaves at 6 sharp. You're late. You're walking. George pocketed the tickets. He collected his change, $11 and some coins, and turned away from the window. The crowd swallowed him. Reeves grabbed the cases and followed, pushing through the press of bodies. They found a bench near platform 3. George sat. Reeves remained standing with the cases between his feet, scanning the station the way he'd learned to scan ground in Natal, looking for trouble before trouble found you. A porter approached, young and black, his uniform too big in the shoulders. He looked at the cases, then at George. Help with your luggage. Sir, we're managing. Thank you, George said. Long journey ahead. Chicago's 2 days by rail. I could stow these proper for you. Make sure they don't get lost. George pulled a coin from his pocket, a quarter. I appreciate the offer, but we're traveling light. Perhaps you could direct us to a decent boarding house. Something clean and cheap. The porter took the coin. Clean and cheap don't often meet in Boston. But there's a place on Hanover Street. Mrs. Yablonsky's, tell her Marcus sent you. She'll treat you fair. Marcus, George said. Thank you. The porter tipped his cap and moved off, looking for other passengers with heavier bags and looser purses. George watched him work the platform, all hustle and smile, making his living from other people's needs. Reminds me of you, Reeves. Reeves looked down at his lord. How so, my lord? Always working, always helping, never complaining about it. Someone has to keep things running. Indeed. George leaned back against the bench, his eyes closed. 2 days crossing the Atlantic in steerage, then the train from New York, then the scene at the Ashworth mansion. It was showing in the lines around his mouth, the shadows under his eyes. A man dropped onto the bench beside them, older, maybe 60, with a face like cracked leather and hands that had seen work. He wore a docker's clothes, canvas pants, wool shirt, boots caked with dried mud. He pulled a pipe from his pocket and packed it with tobacco. You're English, the man said. George opened his eyes. Guilty, thought so. Heard you talking to Marcus. You got that way of talking like every word costs money, so you better pronounce it right. I'll take that as a compliment. Wasn't meant as one. The man struck a match, held it to the pipe bowl, puffed until smoke rose. Name's Sullivan. Worked the docks. Been listening to English lords give orders for 30 years now. You all sound the same. Reeves shifted his weight. George raised a hand, slightly weight. I imagine we do, George said. Rather like how all American dockers sound the same to me. Sullivan grinned around his pipe stem. Fair point. You heading west Chicago? Business. Personal. Personal. Sullivan puffed smoke. Long way to go for personal. Must be a woman. George said nothing. Reeves watched the crowd, but listened. Sullivan turned to Reeves. You his servant? Valet, Reeves said. What's the difference? About 20 pounds a year, and the quality of the uniform. Sullivan laughed, coughing smoke. I like him. He always this sharp. Usually, sharper, George said. The Atlantic crossing dulled his edge. Steerage, yes, that'll do it. I came over from Cork in steerage, back in 48. 3 weeks in the dark, sleeping on boards, eating slop that wouldn't feed pigs. Half the passengers died before we saw New York. Sullivan drew on his pipe. You don't look like you're used to steerage. We're not. George said we're getting used to a great many things we're not used to. Hard times. You could say that. Sullivan nodded. He smoked in silence, watching the station fill with evening travelers. A woman chased a child past their bench. 2 men argued in Italian near the ticket window. A dog nosed threw trash under the platform. Your man there, Sullivan said, pointing with his pipe at Reeves. He's got the look. What look? George asked. Soldier. I seen enough of them to know. The way he stands, watching everything, the scar on his jaw. That's not from shaving. Reeves touched his jaw without thinking. The scar ran from his ear to his chin, pale against his weathered skin. A Zulu Assegai had put it there, 17 years ago. You fought? Sullivan asked him directly. Yes, Reeves said. Where? South Africa, Natal. A place called Rorke's Drift. Sullivan's eyebrows went up. Rorke's Drift. I read about that in the papers. 100 British soldiers, couple thousand Zulus. You were there, I was there, and you lived. 11 of us died. Took 17 hours. We built walls from anything we could find. Biscuit boxes, mealie bags, hospital cots. They kept coming in waves. We kept shooting. Reeves stopped. He'd told this story before. 2 officers who wrote reports, to his mother who cried, to young George who'd listened wide-eyed in the library at Addington Hall. The words always came out the same flat, factual, emptied of the fear he'd felt. Sullivan whistled low. 17 hours. Jesus. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded after, Reeves said. I wasn't one of them. I just did what needed doing. You stayed alive. That's something. I stayed alive because the man next to me stayed alive. He stayed alive because I did. That's how it works. George was watching Reeves now. Reeves felt the look, but didn't meet it. There were parts of Rorke's Drift he'd never told his lord. The smell of blood and burned thatch. The sound of assegais hitting the walls. The moment when he'd been sure they'd all die and hadn't cared anymore. Just kept loading and firing until his hands moved without thought. So you fought Zulus, Sullivan said, and now you're crossing America, chasing some woman for your lord here. That's quite a change. Not so different, Reeves said, still following orders, still keeping someone alive. George stood. Reeves, my lord, Mr. Sullivan's right. You don't have to follow me to Chicago. I can manage alone. Reeves looked at him. With all respect, my lord, you can't. I'm not helpless. Never said you were, but your nobility. You were raised to lead estates and sit in parliament and know which fork to use. You weren't raised to track runaway women across America. And you were. I was raised to survive. Different skill, same result. Reeves picked up the cases. Besides, your mother would kill me if I let you wander off alone. She's more frightening than any Zulu. Sullivan laughed. I like him even more now. George looked at Reeves for a long moment. Something passed between them, not words, but understanding built over years of service and something deeper than service. Reeves had been 17 when he'd enlisted, 22 when he'd come home from Natal with a scar and a limp. George had been 12, small and serious, spending his days in the library while his father invested in doomed ventures. They'd grown up together in a house that was falling apart, learning different lessons from the same failure. Very well, George said. Chicago it is. Chicago it is, Reeves agreed. Sullivan stood, knocking ash from his pipe. You boys are all right. For English lords and their valets. He looked at George. Word of advice though, America ain't England. People here don't care about titles or bloodlines. They care about what you can do and whether you can do it better than the next man. You want to find this woman and make her marry you. You better figure out what you're good at besides pronouncing words right. I'll keep that in mind, George said. Sullivan tipped an imaginary hat and walked off into the crowd, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the evening chill. George sat back down. Reeves remained standing. He's right, you know, George said. About which part? All of it. I'm not built for this. I am built for estate management and social calls and arguing in the House of Lords about tariffs and taxes. You're also built for boxing, fencing, and shooting. You speak 4 languages. You can calculate compound interest in your head. You've read every military history in your father's library. Reeves set the cases down. You're built for whatever you decide you're built for, my lord. When did you become a philosopher? Somewhere around hour 14 at Rorke's Drift. When you think you're going to die. You get philosophical fast. George smiled a real smile, the first Reeves had seen since they'd landed in Boston. We're not going to die in Chicago. Probably not, but it won't be comfortable. Nothing about this will be comfortable. No, my lord, it won't. They sat in silence while the station filled with shadows. Gas lamps flickered on along the platforms. The crowd thinned as trains arrived and departed, swallowing passengers and spitting them out in different cities. At 5:30, George stood. Mrs. Yablonsky's boarding house. We should find it before dark. Lead on, my lord. They walked out into Boston's evening streets with their cases and their $11. And the 2 tickets to Chicago that would carry them deeper into a country neither understood, chasing a woman who didn't want to be caught. Behind them, the station clock struck 6. Somewhere west, Claudia Ashworth was eating dinner in a dining car, watching America scroll past her window, thinking she was free. The train jerked forward at 6:03. George braced himself against the window as the car lurched, throwing passengers into their seats. Across from him, a woman clutched a basket. Behind him, someone's luggage crashed to the floor. The engine's whistle screamed, and they rolled out of Boston into morning fog. Second class was crowded. Wooden benches faced each other, packed with farmers and clerks and mothers with crying babies. The air smelled like sweat and yesterday's bread and the coal smoke that leaked through every crack in the car. George sat with his back straight, his hands on his knees, trying to occupy less space than his frame required. Reeves sat beside him, somehow looking comfortable despite the cramped quarters. 2 days of this, George said. Could be worse. My lord, how? Could be steerage again. George conceded the point with a nod. The train picked up speed, leaving Boston behind in a blur of brick buildings and church spires. They crossed a Bridgewater below, dark and moving fast, then plunged into countryside. A man dropped into the seat across from them, 30 maybe, with slicked hair and a smile that showed too many teeth. He wore a checked suit that had seen better days and carried a worn leather satchel. Gentlemen, he said. Fine morning for travel. George nodded politely and turned back to the window. First time to Chicago? The man asked. Yes, George said. You'll love it. City of opportunity. City of the future. Everything moves fast. There the trains, the money, the people. He pulled a deck of cards from his pocket, shuffled them one-handed. Name's Garrison. I sell patent medicine. Dr. Kilmer's swamp root cures everything from dyspepsia to female hysteria. Impressive range, George said. That's what I tell people. Garrison dealt cards onto his Nickwick. Practiced motions. You play poker, friend. Occasionally, how about a friendly game? Pass the time. Nothing serious, Benny Ante. Just for sport. Reeves coughed softly. George looked at Garrison's hands. The fingers were nimble, moving cards like a conjurer moved scarves. The nails were clean, but the knuckles were scarred. A man who worked with his hands but not in any honest trade. I appreciate the offer, George said, but I think not. Come on, just a few hands. Make the journey interesting. The journey is interesting enough. Garrison's smile thinned. He looked at Reeves, then back at George. You think I'm cheating? That it? Think the American card sharp is going to fleece the English gentleman. I think you're a professional and I'm not. The odds favor you. Smart fellow. Garrison scooped up the cards. Most marks, excuse me, most passengers, they don't figure it out until they're down to their shoelaces. You got a good eye. My father played cards, lost considerably. I learned from his mistakes. Your father, huh? Garrison pocketed the deck. Let me guess, English lord, old money, drank too much and gambled more. George's jaw tightened. Reeves shifted in his seat. Easy, friend, Garrison said. No offense meant. I've met 100 fellows like him, good men, who thought luck would turn around if they just played one more hand. It never does. House always wins. That's the first lesson. What's the second? George asked. Never play against the house. A woman pushed down the aisle, dragging a small boy by the hand. The boy was crying, his face red and snotty. She sat in the remaining space across from them, pulling the boy onto her lap. He squirmed and wailed. Hush, she said. We've got hours yet. You can't cry the whole way. The boy cried harder. Garrison stood. I'll find another car. Less crowded. He tipped an imaginary hat to George. Safe travels, friend. Hope you find what you're looking for in Chicago. He moved off down the aisle. Satchel swinging. Cards probably already out in the next car, looking for easier marks. The woman rocked her son, humming something tuneless. George watched the countryside roll past farms and forests, small towns with church steeples, stations where the trains stopped to take on water and passengers. He was good, Reeves said quietly. The card sharp, very good. Did you see how he marked us the moment we sat down? Foreigners, well-dressed enough to have money, not American enough to know the local tricks. You would have stopped me from playing. I would have tried. Whether you'd have listened is another question. George smiled. I listened to you more than you think. That's a comfort, my lord. The boy across from them finally stopped crying. His mother set him on the bench and pulled bread and cheese from her basket. She broke it into pieces, handed them over. The boy ate, sniffling, wiping his nose on his sleeve. You going to Chicago too? She asked George. Yes, ma'am. Business or family? Personal matter. She nodded, not pushing. We're going to my sister's. Her husband works the stockyards. Says there's good money there, if you don't mind the smell. She looked at her son, who was cramming cheese into his mouth. We don't mind the smell. I hope it works out well for you, George said. Hope's cheap. Work's what matters. She pulled out more bread. You want some? I packed extra, thank you, but we're provided for. They ate in silence while the train rattled west. George watched the landscape change. Fewer farms, more wild land, trees that seemed to go on forever. America was enormous. He'd known it intellectually, seen it on maps, but seeing it through a train window made it real. England could fit inside this country a dozen times and still leave room. Somewhere out here, Claudia Ashworth was running. Maybe on a train like this one, maybe already in Chicago. Maybe further west. She had a day's head start, maybe two, but she didn't know he was coming. That was his advantage. My lord, Reeves said. George looked at him. What happens when we find her? I convince her to honor the arrangement, and if she refuses, then I convince her harder. That's not much of a plan. It's the only plan I have. The train lurched over rough track. The woman's boy fell against the window, then scrambled back to his mother's lap. She held him, still rocking, her face tired in the morning light. George pulled Claudia's letter from his pocket. He'd read it so many times the creases were wearing thin. I will not be purchased like a mare at auction. Strong words, clear thinking. Not the writing of someone who'd change her mind easily. She's intelligent, George said. My lord, Claudia. Her letter, it's well written, precise. She knows what she wants and why she wants it. That makes her dangerous. Or reasonable. Perhaps we can negotiate. Reeves looked skeptical but said nothing. The morning wore into afternoon. The train stopped at a station water tower, wooden platform, a handful of houses scattered beyond. Some passengers got off. Others got on. A man with a barrel organ and a monkey worked the platform, music tinkling over the engine's hiss. George watched the monkey collect coins in a tin cup. It wore a tiny vest and cap, its eyes old and sad. The organ grinder cranked his machine, the same tune over and over, while the monkey danced. Depressing, George said. The monkey, the whole enterprise. That man probably makes more in a day than most farmers make in a week. All because people like watching a sad monkey dance. People like entertainment. They'll pay for it. I suppose they will. The whistle blew. They jerked forward again, leaving the organ grinder and his monkey behind. The woman across from them was asleep now. Her son curled against her, both of them breathing in rhythm with the train's motion. George closed his eyes. He'd slept 3 hours at Mrs. Jablonski's boarding house, a thin mattress, thin walls, sounds from the street all night. His body ached from sitting. His mind kept calculating $11 left, minus food, minus any unexpected costs. They'd reach Chicago broke unless he was careful, unless he found another way to make money. Reeves, he said, without opening his eyes. My lord, what am I good at? Many things. Name 3 that would work in America. Reeves was quiet for a moment. You box well. Cambridge champion, if I recall. I'm not going to box my way to Chicago. You shoot well. Better than most gentlemen. Also not useful on a train. And you think clearly under pressure. You don't panic. That's worth more than boxing or shooting. George opened his eyes. Do you really believe that? I saw men panic at Rorke's Drift. Good men, Brave men, who just couldn't think when the Zulus came over the walls. They died. The ones who kept thinking lived. You're a thinker, my lord. That'll keep you alive here, same as anywhere. I hope you're right. I'm always right. You just don't always notice. George smiled despite himself. Outside, the sun was high now, burning off the morning fog. They passed through a town main street, shops, church, cemetery, on a hill. Then back into countryside, endless and green. 2 more hours passed. The woman and her boy woke, ate more bread, stared out the window. Other passengers slept or talked or read newspapers. The car smelled worse, now sweat and smoke and something like spoiled meat from someone's luggage. George felt his eyes getting heavy. He'd fought it all morning, but now he was losing. Sleep, my lord, Reeves said. I'll watch. Watch for what? Whatever needs watching. George let his eyes close. The train's rhythm rocked him, steady as a heartbeat. He dreamed about Addington Hall walking the portrait gallery while rain hammered the windows. His mother's voice calling from somewhere distant. His father standing in front of the 4th Earl's painting, his back turned, shoulders slumped in defeat. He woke to Reeves shaking his shoulder. My lord. George sat up, blinking. The sun was lower now, slanting through the windows. He looked where Reeves pointed. A man 3 rows up was showing something to his seatmate, a piece of paper, folded small. The seatmate looked at it, shook his head, handed it back. The first man moved to the next row, showed the paper again. What is it? George asked. Reward poster. I think. He's been working the whole car. The man reached their row. He was older, grizzled, with the sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. He held out the paper. You've seen this man? The sheriff asked. George took the poster. A face sketched in crude lines, words printed below. Wanted for stage robbery. Jack Timber Malone. $500 reward. George's hand tightened on the paper. $500. More than enough to reach Chicago and beyond. No, he said. Haven't seen him. The sheriff took the poster back. He's operating between here and St. Louis. Hits stages, takes the strong boxes, vanishes. Been doing it 3 months now. I catch him, that reward's mine. But if any civilians spot him first, he shrugged. 500's 500. Whoever brings him in gets paid. He moved down the car. George watched him go. Reeves was looking at him. My lord, don't start. We're not bounty hunters. We are now, George said. We are whatever keeps us moving. Outside, the sun touched the horizon. The train carried them west, toward Chicago, toward Claudia, toward whatever came next. And somewhere between here and St. Louis, a man named Timber Malone was robbing stages. Not knowing an English lord with empty pockets and nothing to lose was memorizing his face from a wanted poster. The conductor's hand was on Sarah's arm before Claudia saw him move. They were in the passage between cars, the floor rattling under their feet, wind screaming through the gaps. Claudia had gone to stretch her legs, Sarah following. The conductor had appeared from nowhere, big man, whiskey breath, eyes that moved over them like hands. Ladies shouldn't wander, he said. His fingers tightened on Sarah's sleeve. Dangerous back here. You could fall. Sarah pulled her arm. He didn't let go. We're returning to our seats, Claudia said. Her voice came out higher than she wanted. In a minute, the conductor smiled. His teeth were brown. First, let's talk about your tickets. I need to inspect them again. Company policy. You inspected them in Buffalo, Sarah said. Did I? Don't recall. He pulled Sarah closer. The train swayed. Claudia grabbed the wall to keep from falling. Maybe you can remind me. Back in the freight car, quieter there, Claudia's heart hammered. She'd read dime novels about frontier justice, about brave women who talked their way out of danger. None of those stories prepared her for this, the smell of unwashed wool and cheap liquor, the casual way he held Sarah like she was property he'd already bought. Let her go, Claudia said. Or what? The conductor's other hand went to Sarah's waist. You'll report me. To who? The railroad don't care what happens to Chinese girls in passages. Sarah's hand moved to her hat, dark blue felt with a long pin. Claudia saw her friend's fingers close around it. The conductor saw too. He laughed. What you gonna do with that? Poke me. Yes, Sarah said, and drove the pin into his thigh. He roared. His hands flew to the wound. Sarah yanked the pin. Free it came out. Bloody Ann shoved him hard. He stumbled backward, hit the door, nearly fell through, into the gap between cars. Run, Sarah said. They ran. Through the passage, into the next car, down the aisle past staring passengers. Behind them, the conductor was shouting. Someone yelled. Claudia's skirts tangled her legs. She hitched them up and kept moving. They burst into their car. Their seats were 3 rows back. Claudia dove into hers, Sarah right behind. They sat breathing hard, faces flushed, the hat pin still in Sarah's hand. An old man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. Trouble? No, Claudia said. Looked like trouble. We're fine. The conductor appeared at the far end of the car. He was limping, his face red, his hand pressed to his leg. He scanned the passengers, found them, started down the aisle. Claudia's mouth went dry. Sarah gripped the hat pin. The conductor stopped at their row. He leaned down, close enough that Claudia smelled his breath again, whiskey and something rotten underneath. You stabbed me, he said to Sarah. You put your hands on me, Sarah said. I removed them. I could have you arrested. Assault on a railroad employee. Try it, the old man said. He'd set his newspaper aside. His hand rested on something in his lap, a pistol. Worn but clean. I saw what happened through the window. You were assaulting these ladies. Any judge in Buffalo would side with them. The conductor looked at the pistol. At the old man, the other passengers watching now. Their conversation stopped, their faces curious or hostile. This ain't over, he said. Yes it is, the old man said. You're going to walk back to your post. You're going to leave these ladies alone. And you going to consider yourself lucky that girl used a hat pin instead of my gun. The conductor straightened. He looked at Claudia and Sarah one more time, a look that promised nothing good, then limped back down the aisle and out of the car. Silence held for a moment. Then conversations resumed, passengers turning back to their newspapers and lunch pails. The drama already forgotten. The old man picked up his paper. You girls should lock your compartment door tonight. If you got a compartment, we don't, Claudia said. We're in coach, then sit with your backs to the wall and keep that hat pin handy. He went back to reading. Sarah wiped the pin on her handkerchief. Her hands were shaking. Claudia reached over and squeezed them. Thank you, Claudia said. For what? For being faster than me, braver than me. I wasn't brave, I was terrified. Sarah pushed the pin back through her hat. But my mother told me once, when men see you as less than human, you have to remind them you have teeth. Your mother sounds formidable. She had to be. Chinese woman married to an English businessman in San Francisco. She learned to fight before she learned to read English. Sarah leaned back against the seat. Her face was pale. This is what you wanted, Claudia. This is freedom. Claudia looked out the window. They were passing through farmland, neat fields, white farmhouses, fence lines straight as rulers, safe and clean and far from where she'd been raised. She'd thought running west meant adventure, like in the dime novels, cowboys and sunsets and her own choices. She hadn't expected whiskey breath and grabbing hands and realizing nobody would help if you screamed. I don't know what I wanted, Claudia said. We could still go back. To what? My father's shipping me off to England, marrying some lord I've never met who only wants me for money. At least in Boston, you wouldn't get assaulted in train passages. Maybe, or maybe. I'd get trapped in a marriage where my husband felt entitled to anything he wanted because he owned me legally. Claudia turned from the window. That conductor thought he could grab you because nobody would care. How is that different from my father selling me to Lord George? Different kind of ownership, same result. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You think your English lord would be like that? Like the conductor? I don't know, I've never met him. That's the point. Most women don't meet their husbands before the wedding. It's how things work. Most women don't have a choice. I do. I'm choosing differently. You're choosing danger. I'm choosing my own danger, not someone else's. The train rattled over a bridge. Water flashed below a river, brown and swollen with spring rain. Claudia watched it disappear behind them, carrying everything downstream toward wherever rivers went. A woman further up the car was nursing a baby, a blanket draped for modesty. Two men argued quietly about politics. A boy pressed his face to the window, watching America scroll past. Normal people doing normal things. None of them had just stabbed a conductor with a hat pin. We need to be smarter, Sarah said. How travel during day? Stay in public places. Don't wander. Sarah pulled her botanical book from her bag, opened it to a random page. And we need to reach Chicago fast. The longer we're on trains, the more men like that conductor we'll meet. How long until Chicago? 2 days. Maybe 3, if the weather's bad. 2 days. Claudia tried to imagine 2 more days of this sighting, rigid in her seat, watching every man who passed, wondering which one would be next. Then Chicago, then St. Louis, then Santa Fe. Weeks of travel. Months maybe. She pulled her mother's cameo from her reticule. The gold was warm from being against her body. She opened at her mother's face on one side, her father's on the other, both painted when they were young, before Claudia was born, back when they'd presumably loved each other. Her mother had died when Claudia was 12. Pneumonia that winter, quick and cruel. Claudia remembered her father sitting in the parlor afterward, holding this cameo, not speaking. He'd closed it finally and put it away. Never mentioned her mother again except in practical terms. Your mother would have wanted this or that. Claudia snapped the cameo shut. My mother ran away too, she said. Sarah looked up. What? Before she married my father, her parents wanted her to marry someone else, older, richer. She refused. Took a train to New York, lived there 6 months, working as a governess. My father found her, convinced her to come back. They got married and everyone pretended the running away never happened. I don't know, she never said, but she kept this cameo like it proved something, like it was evidence that at least once, she'd chosen for herself. And then she died in childbirth, having her 6th baby in 12 years. Claudia looked at Sarah. Yes, that's what choosing for yourself got her. 6 babies in an early grave. Or maybe she chose wrong. Maybe she should have stayed in New York. You don't know that. You're making up stories about someone you barely remember. The words stung because they were true. Claudia was 12 when her mother died. She remembered fragments of voice singing lullabies, hands braiding hair, the rustle of skirts in hallways. But who her mother really was, what she thought, what she wanted, that was lost. I'm not going back, Claudia said. I know. Even if Lord George comes after me. He won't. He'd have to care first. And men don't cross oceans for women they don't know. He might care about the money. Money he can get anywhere. There are 100 American girls who'd trade their futures for a title. You're just the one your father picked. Claudia wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe Lord George would read her letter, shrug, find some other heiress to save his English estate. But something in her father's voice when he'd described the arrangement, the eagerness, the desperation suggested, this match mattered more than she understood. The train began to slow. Another station ahead, water tower, wooden platform, a handful of buildings scattered like dice someone had thrown. We should buy food here, Sarah said. If they're selling any, I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. We don't know when the next stop is. They gathered their things as the train lurched to a halt. Steam hissed. The conductor, a different one, older, kinder-looking, opened the doors and called out the station name. Claudia didn't catch it. She stepped onto the platform into afternoon sun. The air smelled clean after the coal smoke and sweat of the train. A few passengers milled around. A vendor sold meat pies from a cart, the crust golden and steaming. Sarah bought 2 pies, handed one to Claudia. They ate standing on the platform, watching the train take on water. The pie was good beef and gravy, the pastry flaky. Claudia hadn't realized she was hungry until she was swallowing the last bite. Better? Sarah asked. Better. A whistle blew. They climbed back aboard, found their seats, settled in for whatever came next. The train pulled out of the station. Claudia watched the little town disappear, the vendor packing up his cart, the station master waving them off, the buildings getting smaller until they were just dots on the horizon. She thought about the conductor with his grabbing hands, about her mother dying young, about Lord George, whoever he was, probably reading her letter right now in Boston, probably cursing her name. Let him curse. She'd made her choice. The train carried them west into uncertain territory. 2 women running from different pasts toward a future nobody could predict. Sarah wiped the pin on her handkerchief. Her hands were shaking. Claudia reached over and squeezed them. Thank you, Claudia said. For what? For being faster than me, braver than me. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. Sarah pushed the pin back through her hat. But my mother told me once, when men see you as less than human, you have to remind them you have teeth. Your mother sounds formidable. She had to be. Chinese woman married to an English businessman in San Francisco. She learned to fight before she learned to read English. Sarah leaned back against the seat. Her face was pale. This is what you wanted, Claudia. This is freedom. Claudia looked out the window. They were passing through farmland, neat fields, white farmhouses, fence lines straight as rulers, safe and clean and far from where she'd been raised. She'd thought running west meant adventure, like in the dime novels, cowboys and sunsets, and her own choices. She hadn't expected whiskey breath and grabbing hands and realizing nobody would help if you screamed. I don't know what I wanted, Claudia said. We could still go back. To what? My father shipping me off to England, marrying some lord I've never met who only wants me for money. At least in Boston, you wouldn't get assaulted in train passages. Maybe, or maybe, I'd get trapped in a marriage where my husband felt entitled to anything he wanted because he owned me legally. Claudia turned from the window. That conductor thought he could grab you because nobody would care. How is that different from my father selling me to Lord George? Different kind of ownership, same result. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You think your English lord would be like that? Like the conductor? I don't know. I've never met him. That's the point. Most women don't meet their husbands before the wedding. It's how things work. Most women don't have a choice. I do. I'm choosing differently. You're choosing danger. I'm choosing my own danger, not someone else's. The train rattled over a bridge. Water flashed below a river, brown and swollen with spring rain. Claudia watched it disappear behind them, carrying everything downstream toward wherever rivers went. A woman further up the car was nursing a baby, a blanket draped for modesty. 2 men argued quietly about politics. A boy pressed his face to the window, watching America scroll past. Normal people doing normal things. None of them had just stabbed a conductor with a hat pin. We need to be smarter, Sarah said. How travel during day? Stay in public places. Don't wander. Sarah pulled her botanical book from her bag, opened it to a random page. And we need to reach Chicago fast. The longer we're on trains, the more men like that conductor we'll meet. How long until Chicago? 2 days. Maybe 3, if the weather's bad. 2 days. Claudia tried to imagine 2 more days of this sighting, rigid in her seat, watching every man who passed, wondering which one would be next. Then Chicago, then St. Louis, then Santa Fe. Weeks of travel. Months maybe. The smell hit George before he saw the city. Blood and offal and something burning, carried on wind that made his eyes water. The train slowed, crossing into Chicago's outskirts, wooden houses, packed tight, muddy streets, smoke rising from 100 chimneys. Good Lord, George said. Reeves looked out the window. The stockyards were downwind. The train crawled past slaughterhouses the size of cathedrals. George caught glimpses through gaps in buildings, pens full of cattle, men with clubs and knives, blood running in channels toward the river. The river itself looked like rust, thick and slow. How many animals? George asked. Thousands a day, I'd expect. This is where the whole country sends its meat. The woman with the boy still riding with them from Boston gathered her things. Her face was set, determined. The boy pressed his nose to the window, watching the stockyards with wide eyes. Welcome to Chicago, son, she said, where fortunes are made and futures are earned. She didn't mention the smell. The train pulled into Union Depot at 2 in the afternoon. George stepped onto the platform into chaos, passengers shoving, porters shouting, vendors selling everything from newspapers to roasted nuts. Steam and smoke mixed overhead, turning the air gray. Reeves carried their cases. George carried the $11 they had left after buying food on the train. $11 in a city that looked like it ate money for breakfast. We need to find where she stayed, George said. Hotels first, then boarding houses. How many hotels are there? Reeves looked at the city spreading before them, buildings climbing toward the sky. Streets clogged with wagons and carriages, people moving in rivers. Too many. They started with the depot, hotel, 3 stories of brick. Windows overlooking the platforms. The clerk was young and bored, picking at his teeth with a matchstick. I'm looking for 2 women, George said. English, traveling together. One possibly Chinese. They would have arrived 3 days ago. The clerk looked at George's clothes, rumpled from 2 days on the train, but still well cut, still obviously expensive. You a bill collector? Family matter. Family matter. The clerk grinned. Right, and I'm President Grant. George put $1 on the counter. Have you seen them? The dollar disappeared. Maybe. What do they look like? One's about 24, brown hair, well-spoken. The other is mixed race, educated, same age approximately. Lots of women come through here. Brown hair don't narrow it much. George put another $1 down. That left 9. The clerk made the second $1 vanish like the first. He leaned back in his chair, the matchstick working his molars. No Chinese girls stayed here. Boss, don't rent to them. Policy. What about the other woman? English, traveling alone, or with companions? Didn't see anybody like that. But try the Palmer House, where all the rich folks go. Your lady sounds rich. George collected his dignity and left. Outside, the afternoon was getting late. Shadows stretched across streets, still muddy from yesterday's rain. Wagons splashed through puddles. A streetcar clanged past, packed with workers heading home. The Palmer House, George said. That's miles from here. My lord, and expensive. We're asking questions, not renting rooms. They walked. George's feet hurt in his good boots. Blisters were forming where the leather rubbed. He'd worn these boots maybe a dozen times in England church, social calls, the occasional hunt. Now they were falling apart from actual use. The Palmer House rose 6 stories, all marble and glass. A doorman in burgundy livery stood at the entrance. His mustache waxed into points. Hotel guests only, he said when George approached. I'm inquiring about guests. 2 women, English, arrived 3 days ago. I don't give out information about guests. George pulled out $1. His third $1 gone in an hour. He was bleeding money. The doorman looked at the $1. Make it 2-1 now. 1, if the information is useful. The doorman took the $1. What kind of useful? Did they stay here? Where did they go after? Nobody matching that stayed here. I'd remember. We don't get many English ladies. He held out his hand. Now the second $1. That wasn't useful. You asked a question. I answered it. That's useful. George turned away. Behind him, the doorman laughed. Try the cheaper places. The doorman called. Maybe she ain't as rich as you think. They tried cheaper places. The Sherman House, no, the Tremont, a boarding house on State Street where the landlady looked at them like they were selling typhus. No English ladies, no Chinese girls. Move along. George's feet screamed. His stomach was empty. The sun was setting, turning Chicago's smoke into orange haze. My lord, Reeves said. We need to eat. Find a place to sleep. After we check the train station, see if anyone remembers selling them tickets. That could take hours. Then it takes hours. They walked back to Union Depot. George's boots left bloody prints on the boardwalk. He didn't mention it. Reeves didn't either. The ticket windows were closing. George found a clerk counting receipts, his spectacles sliding down his nose. I'm trying to locate 2 women who would have bought tickets 3 days ago. Can you check your records? The clerk didn't look up. Records are private. It's important. So's my supper. Come back tomorrow. George leaned against the counter. His head hurt, his feet hurt, everything hurt. Please, I've crossed an ocean to find them. 5 minutes of your time. The clerk looked up. He studied George's face, the exhaustion, the desperation barely hidden. What's your name? The clerk asked. William, George, and these women. One's named Claudia Ashworth, English, the other's Sarah Chen. The clerk pushed his spectacles up. You with the police? No. Personal matter. Personal? The clerk went back to his counting. See, here's the thing. Women come through here every day, buying tickets west, running from something or toward something, don't matter which. Half of them got men following husbands, fathers, brothers, all claiming personal matter. He licked his thumb, counted more bills. I don't help men chase women. Policy. I'm not chasing her to hurt her. I'm trying to save my family's estate. There's an arrangement, a marriage arrangement. She agreed to it, then ran. She agreed, or her father agreed. George said nothing. Thought so. The clerk bundled his receipts with twine. Listen, Lord, you are a lord, right? I can hear it in how you talk. Maybe she ran because she didn't want to be arranged. Ever think of that? Of course I've thought of that. But there are larger considerations, debts, obligations, her father's reputation, my family's survival. That's a lot of pressure on one girl. It's reality. The clerk stood. He was small, maybe 50, with ink stains on his fingers, and the tired eyes of a man who'd seen every kind of human desperation pass through his station. I'll tell you what I tell everyone asking about runaway women, he said. If she bought a ticket here, I don't remember. If she mentioned where she was going, I didn't hear. And if you want to find her, you better ask yourself why she ran in the first place. He walked away, leaving George alone at the counter. Reeves appeared beside him. My lord, she was here. I know she was here. Knowing it and proving it are different things. George looked around the station. Passengers streamed past, all of them going somewhere, all of them running toward something or away from it. Somewhere in this flood of people, 3 days ago, Claudia Ashworth had stood buying a ticket. Had she been scared, excited, relieved? He'd never know unless he found her. The Stockyards district, George said. That woman on the train, the one with the boy, she said her brother-in-law works there. Maybe he knows boarding houses where women stay. Places that don't ask questions. That's a long shot. It's the only shot we have. They left the station as night fell. Gas lamps flickered to life along the streets. Chicago transformed in the darkness, the smoke less visible, the mud less obvious, everything softened by yellow light. George limped. Blood had soaked through his right sock. Reeves noticed but said nothing. They found the stockyards by smell. Even at night, the slaughter continued, cattle lowing in the pens, men shouting, the wet sound of cutting. Buildings loomed in the darkness, windows lit from inside, showing glimpses of work that never stopped. We'll never find her brother-in-law, Reeves said. No, but we'll find someone who knows someone. That's how information works. They stopped at a saloon, rough pine boards. Sawdust on the floor, men drinking after shifts. George pushed through the door. Conversation stopped. Faces turned. 100 eyes measured him, his clothes, his bearing, his foreignness. The bartender was built like a bull, arms thick as fence posts. We don't serve your kind here. My kind. Rich folks, society folks. Whatever you are, I'm looking for information. George said, about 2 women who passed through Chicago 3 days ago. English, traveling west. I'll pay for the information. How much? George pulled out his last $8. Put them on the bar. Every dollar he had left in the world. The room went quiet. Men stared at the money like it was the crown jewels. That's for information, George said. Not speculation. Not guesses. Someone in this room knows where women go when they rerunning and don't want to be found. Tell me, and this is yours. Nobody moved. Then a voice from the back corner. What's she to you? George turned. An old man sat alone at a table, a glass of something amber in front of him. His face was weathered, his hands scarred from labor. She's my future, George said. Or she was supposed to be. And now she's running from you. From an arrangement she didn't choose, but you chose it. I chose survival. For my family. For my name. The old man drank, set his glass down with a click. There's a boarding house on Dearborn Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Kowalski. She takes in women, no questions asked. If your girl came through here and was smart, that's where she went. How do I find it? 4 blocks north, 2 blocks east, yellow door. Can't miss it. George gathered the $8. He walked to the old man's table and put all of it down. That's too much, the old man said. It's exactly right. George left. Reeves followed. Outside, the night was cold, the smoke less visible, but still there, coating everything. Dearborn Street, George said. My lord, we're broke now. We'll figure it out. They walked through Chicago's dark streets, past buildings that blocked out stars, past alleys where things moved in shadows. George's feet left blood on the boardwalk. His stomach was empty, his pockets were empty. But for the first time since Boston, he had a direction. 4 blocks north, 2 blocks east, a yellow door. Claudia Ashworth had been there 3 days ago. The trail was getting warmer. The yellow door was peeling. George stood on the steps of Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house at 7 in the morning. watching paint curl away from the wood like old skin. Windows on either side showed lace curtains gone gray with soot. A cat sat in one window, watching him with eyes that suggested he was late for something important. Reeves knocked. They waited. The door opened. A woman filled the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wore an apron over a black dress, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands red from work. "Mrs. Kowalski?" George asked. "Who wants to know?" "Lord William, George. I'm looking for 2 women who may have stayed here 3 days ago. English, traveling together." Mrs. Kowalski looked him up and down. "You police?" "No, ma'am. Bill collector." "No, husband." "Not yet. Potentially." Her eyes narrowed. "Potentially. That's a word that covers a lot of ground." She leaned against the doorframe. "I run a respectable house. Women come here for safety, not to be tracked down by potentially husbands." "I understand. But there's an arrangement, a marriage arrangement. I need to speak with her. She'll want to speak with you." George pulled Claudia's letter from his pocket. The paper was soft now from handling, the creases nearly worn through. She wrote this. "She's made her position clear, but circumstances require that we at least talk." Mrs. Kowalski took the letter. She read it slowly, lips moving slightly. When she finished, she folded it and handed it back. "She's got spine, your girl. She's not my girl. That's her point, isn't it?" Mrs. Kowalski stepped back. "Come in. But your man stays on the porch. Reeves is with me. Reeves can wait outside. I don't allow 2 men in my house at once. Policy." George looked at Reeves. Reeves nodded slightly. "Go ahead." George entered. Mrs. Kowalski closed the door behind him. The front room was clean but worn furniture that had seen better decades. Rugs threadbare in the centers, wallpaper faded where sun hit through the windows. It smelled like lye soap and old wood and something cooking porridge maybe. "Sit," Mrs. Kowalski said. George sat in a chair that creaked under his weight. Mrs. Kowalski remained standing, arms crossed, studying him like he was a horse she might buy if the price was right. "2 women stayed here," she said. 3 nights ago, paid for 1 night, left the next morning on the westbound train." George's chest tightened. "Where were they going?" "Didn't say. Women who come here don't offer itineraries and I don't ask for them, but they mentioned something. A city, a destination. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't." George understood. He reached for his pocket, then remembered he had no money. Not a dollar. Not a cent. He'd spent everything last night at the saloon. Mrs. Kowalski watched him. "Looking for your wallet?" "I'm looking for options." "Options are expensive." George stood. He pulled his watch from his vest pocket, gold, engraved with his family crest. A gift from his father on his 18th birthday, worth maybe $50 if he found the right buyer. "This," he said, "for the information." Mrs. Kowalski took the watch. She turned it over, examining the engraving, the weight, the craftsmanship. She opened the case. The inside was inscribed with his father's handwriting. "To William," with pride. "Father, your father gave you this," she said. "Yes, and you retrading it for information about a girl who doesn't want to be found. For the possibility of saving my family." "Yes." Mrs. Kowalski snapped the watch closed. She held it out to him. "Keep it. I don't understand. Your father gave you this. It means something. Don't trade meaning for geography." She walked to a small desk, pulled out a piece of paper, wrote something on it. "They mentioned St. Louis. Said they were heading there next. Then maybe Santa Fe." The Chinese girl Sarashi seemed scared. The other one, your Claudia, she seemed determined. "That's all I know." She handed him the paper. An address was written in careful script. "Pinkerton Detective Agency, 142 Clark Street." "What's this?" George asked. "People who find people. They're good at it. Expensive, but good. I can't afford." "I know, but maybe they'll work out terms. Pinkertons like money, but they also like impossible cases. Young English lord chasing his runaway bride across America. That's the kind of story they tell over drinks." She opened the door. "Now get out. I've got breakfast to serve." George stepped onto the porch. Reeves stood where he'd left him, patient as stone. "St. Louis," George said. "She's going to St. Louis. That's 400 miles west. Then we'll go 400 miles west." "With what money, my lord?" George looked at his watch, the last thing of value he owned besides his clothes and his father's pistol. The Webley was worth something, but he'd need it if they were serious about hunting Timber Malone for that reward. "The Pinkertons," he said. "We'll see what they want." They walked to Clark Street. The morning was cold, Chicago waking slowly. Shopkeepers swept stoops. Wagons delivered goods. A streetcar clanged past, heading toward the financial district. The Pinkerton office occupied the second floor of a brick building wedged between a tailor and a law firm. A sign in the window read, "We never sleep." Below it, an eye wide open, unblinking, George climbed the stairs. His feet still hurt from yesterday. Every step was a small agony. Inside, a clerk sat at a desk surrounded by files. He was young, 20 maybe, with ink-stained fingers and careful handwriting filling a ledger. "Help you?" he asked, without looking up. "I need to hire a detective. What's the case?" I'm tracking 2 women traveling west. They left Chicago yesterday morning, heading toward St. Louis. The clerk set down his pen. Tracking women who don't want to be tracked. We get a lot of those. He pulled a form from a drawer, slid it across the desk. Fill this out. Fee is $200, plus expenses. You pay half up front, half when we locate them. $200. George stared at the number. I don't have $200. Then we can't help you. I could pay you later. When I marry her, her father will settle money on me. I could pay you from that. The clerk smiled, not cruel, just tired. Everybody wants to pay later. But later don't feed families or pay rent. You got collateral. George showed him the watch. The clerk examined it. Nice piece. Worth maybe $60. That'll get you started but not finished. What about payment and services? I could work off the debt. Doing what? I box, I shoot, I can ride, fence, speak 4 languages. We don't need boxers or fencers. We need money. The clerk handed back the watch. Look, I'll level with you. You seem like a decent fellow, but we run a business, not a charity. You want to track these women, you need $200. You don't have it, you track them yourself. George put the watch away. How would I do that? Same way we do. Check train stations, ask questions, follow the trail. Difference is, we've got contacts in every city between here and San Francisco. We can wire ahead, get eyes on them before they know they're being watched. You're just one man walking blind. 2 men, George said. My valet and I, 2 men walking blind. Then, good luck. George descended the stairs into morning light. Reeves was waiting on the street, watching traffic pass. No luck. Reeves asked. $200. We'd need $200. We don't have $2, I'm aware. They walked without direction, just moving because standing still felt like giving up. George's mind worked through options like his father used to work through betting odds at the track, calculating, adjusting, always finding new reasons the next race would be different. The bounty, Reeves said. George stopped. What? Timber Malone. $500 reward. We find him, turn him in. That's more than enough to hire the Pinkertons and fund our journey. We're not bounty hunters, no, but we're not fools either. That sheriff on the train said Malone operates between here and St. Louis. We're going to St. Louis anyway. Why not look for him along the way? Because we don't know what we're doing. Because he's a dangerous criminal. Because I've never hunted a man in my life. You've hunted deer, you've hunted pheasant. Can't be that different. It's entirely different. Reeves turned to face him. My lord, you asked me on the train what you're good at. I told you thinking under pressure. Here's the pressure. We're broke in a strange city, chasing a woman 400 miles west, with no money, no resources, no plan. We need funds. The bounty provides funds. It's simple mathematics. It's dangerous mathematics. Everything's dangerous now. Staying in England was dangerous. Your creditors would have taken Addington Hall. Coming here was dangerous. Chasing Claudia is dangerous. At least this danger pays. George looked at his valet. Reeves stood calm, his face showing nothing but certainty. He'd fought Zulus with worse odds and lived. Maybe he was right. Maybe danger was just the price of everything worth having. We'd need information, George said, about where Malone operates, his patterns, his habits. The sheriff would have that. We're no longer on the train. We don't know which sheriff, which jurisdiction. So we find out, we ask questions. We do what we've been doing to track Claudia, follow the trail, piece together information, move forward. George pulled the wanted poster from his pocket. He'd kept it from the train, folded small. He opened it. Now Timber Malone's face stared back. Crude sketch, but distinctive. Long jaw, broken nose, eyes set close together. $500. Enough to hire the Pinkertons, enough to track Claudia properly instead of stumbling blind from city to city. Enough to eat and sleep and continue this fool's errand he'd started. We'd need supplies, George said. Horses, provisions, weapons beyond the Webley. We'd need money to get supplies. So we're trapped in a circle. We need money to hunt the bounty. We need the bounty to get money. Reeves smiled slightly. Not a circle, my lord, a challenge. And you like challenges. The stockyards killed thousands of animals every day to feed a growing nation. The railroads tore through wilderness to connect oceans. Everything here was built on someone's calculated risk. Maybe his risk was hunting Timber Malone, or maybe his risk was admitting he couldn't do this alone. The watch, George said. We sell it, get what we can, use that to buy basic supplies. Then we head west and hunt both Claudia and Malone simultaneously. That's sensible. It's desperate. Same thing, different words. They found a pawn shop on State Street. The owner was old and suspicious, examining the watch with a jeweler's loupe, testing the gold with acid, checking the movement like he expected it to explode. $40, he said finally. It's worth $60 at least. Not to me it isn't. $40. Take it or walk. George took it. They left with $40 and no way to tell time except by the sun. George felt lighter and heavier, simultaneously lighter because he'd converted sentiment into currency, heavier because he'd just sold the last gift his father ever gave him. "We'll buy it back," Reeves said, "when this is done." "No, we won't. It's gone." "That's how selling works." "Then your father would understand. He'd want you to survive." George didn't answer. His father had wanted a lot of things: honor, dignity, the family name preserved. None of those things had saved him from dying broke and disappointed. Maybe survival was enough. Maybe that's all anyone could ask for. They bought supplies with the $40 dried beef, hard bread, a second pistol from a gun dealer who didn't ask questions, ammunition for both weapons, 2 canteens, a map of the rail lines between Chicago and St. Louis. The map cost 50 cents. George spread it on the counter, studying the route. Chicago to St. Louis, 400 miles. Dozens of small towns, countless places for a woman to hide or a bandit to strike. "We leave today," George said, "for St. Louis, for wherever the trail leads. Claudia and Malone both. We hunt them both until we find one or the other." Reeves nodded. "Then we'd better eat first. It might be a while before we get another meal." They found a cheap restaurant: sawdust floors, rough tables, stew that tasted like newspaper soaked in grease. George ate everything and wanted more, but didn't have the money for seconds. Outside, Chicago moved around them, indifferent to their problems. A city that swallowed newcomers whole and spit them out, changed or broke them trying. George wasn't broken yet, but he was beginning to understand why his father had failed at everything he'd tried. The world didn't care about honor or titles or good intentions. It only cared about results. George needed results. The bounty would provide them. And somewhere between here and St. Louis, he'd find Claudia Ashworth and convince her that marrying him was better than running forever, or he'd fail and lose everything. Either way, he'd know he tried. The tavern outside Springfield smelled like wet dog and spilled beer. Reeves pushed through the door into smoke and noise. George had gone to the railway office to ask about Claudia again, always asking, always one step behind. Reeves had offered to check the tavern for word about Timber Malone. Really, he just wanted a drink and an hour away from his lord's silent disappointment. The bar was oak, scarred from years of elbows and broken glass. Reeves ordered whiskey. The barkeep poured without comment, 3 fingers in a cloudy glass. "You're not from here," someone said. Reeves turned. A man sat 2 stools down, 50, maybe older, with a gray beard and cavalry suspenders, holding up wool trousers. His eyes were the color of old stone, the kind that had seen things and remembered them. "England," Reeves said. "I can hear it. You got that way of talking crisp, like you're biting each word before letting it go." The man extended his hand. "Sergeant Tom Garrett, 7th Cavalry, retired." Reeves shook it. Reeves, just Reeves. No rank, not anymore. Garrett grinned. "Best kind of soldier. The kind who lived long enough to leave." He signaled the barkeep for another round. "What brings you to this armpit of Illinois?" "Passing through. My employer's tracking someone." "Employer? That's a polite word for master." "He's not my master. He's my lord." "What's the difference?" Reeves drank. The whiskey burned, cheap and raw. "About 300 years of tradition and a salary I haven't seen in 6 months. Garrett laughed, coughing smoke. "I like you. You got that soldier humor, dark as coal dust." He pulled a pipe from his pocket, packed it with tobacco. "So your lord's tracking someone. Debtor, criminal, woman. Ah, always women. They run faster than men and hide better too." He struck a match, held it to the bowl. "She owe him money. She owes him a marriage, or he owes her family. Depends how you look at it." "How do you look at it?" Reeves considered. The tavern hummed around them, men talking, dice rattling, someone singing off-key in the corner. "I look at it as 2 people trapped by circumstances neither one chose, trying to survive the best way they know how. That's diplomatic." "That's true." Garrett puffed his pipe. "You care about this lord of yours. More than I should." "Why?" "Because I watched his father drink himself to death over failed investments. Because I saw his mother go gray, worrying about money. Because when Lord George was 13 years old and his father had just died, I found him in the library at midnight, trying to understand the estate accounts, crying so hard he couldn't see the numbers." Reeves finished his whiskey. "He didn't know I was watching, but I saw him wipe his face and keep working until dawn. That's when I knew he'd be different from his father." "Different? How?" "Harder, smarter, too proud to quit, even when quitting makes sense." Garrett nodded slowly. "That kind of man is dangerous. To himself mostly. That's why I'm here. Someone has to keep him from getting killed by his own stubbornness." "You've done this before?" "Kept someone alive who was determined to die." Reeves touched the scar on his jaw. "Once, long time ago." "Where?" "South Africa. Place called Rorke's Drift." Garrett's eyebrows went up. He removed the pipe from his mouth. "You were at Rorke's Drift, January 2nd. 11 dead, 150 wounded. Fought all night." "Jesus." Garrett set his pipe on the bar. "I read about that in the Army and Navy Journal. 4,000 Zulus, hundreds some British soldiers. defended a mission station with biscuit boxes and hospital cots. Mealy bags. The biscuit boxes didn't hold. You were really there. I was there. Garrett studied him with new eyes. What was it like? Reeves looked at his empty glass. The barkeep refilled it without asking. Reeves drank half before answering. It was like being in hell and knowing hell was going to last forever. They came in waves. We'd shoot them down and they'd keep coming. We built walls. They climbed them. We set fire to the hospital. They ran through the flames. 17 hours of loading and firing until your hands moved without thinking. Until the sound of gunfire was just silence with different texture. You got the scar. There, Asset guy. Zulu's spear. One of them got over the wall. Came at me. I shot him, but he didn't stop. They didn't stop. That was the thing. They just kept coming, even after being shot. His spear caught me here. Reeves traced the line from ear to chin. Felt like being cut with ice. Then Lieutenant Chard pulled him off me and put a bayonet through him. Chard. He got the Victoria Cross. Him and 10 others. I didn't. I just stayed alive. Staying alive is harder than dying brave. Reeves looked at Garrett. You've seen combat. Little Bighorn 76, 2 months ago. I was with Reno's battalion. We were supposed to support Custer. He drank. We got pinned down instead. Spent 2 days on a hilltop while the Lakota surrounded us. Lost half our boys. Custer lost everyone. You blame yourself. Every day Garrett's hand shook slightly, holding his glass. We could hear the gunfire from Custer's position. Could hear it stop. Knew what that meant, but we couldn't move. We were trapped. When the Lakota finally left, we went looking. Found them all dead of reman, stripped and mutilated. Custer with 2 bullets in him, his whole command wiped out. That wasn't your fault. Knowing it and feeling it are different things. Reeves nodded. They drank in silence while the tavern moved around the men who'd never seen combat. Never had to choose between orders and survival. Never had to live with the weight of decisions made in seconds that lasted lifetimes. Your lord, Garrett said finally. This woman, he's chasing. What happens if he catches her and she still refuses? I don't know. What happens if he doesn't catch her? He loses everything. His estate, his family name, his mother's home, and what happens to you? Reeves smiled without humor. I'm a soldier. I follow where I'm led. If he goes down, I go down beside him. That's the contract. That's loyalty. Same thing. Garrett tapped ash from his pipe. I had men like you under me. Men who'd walk into gunfire because their sergeant said to. Lost most of them at Little Bighorn. The ones who survived, they don't write, don't visit. They just want to forget I existed because I remind them of the worst day of their lives. They don't blame you. Maybe not. But I blame myself enough for everyone. He signaled for another round. Here's what I learned on that hilltop, waiting for the Lakota to finish us. Dying is easy. Living with what you couldn't do. That's the hard part. Your lord better understand that before he catches this woman, because if she looks him in the eye and says no, he'll have to live with it. He'll survive. Will he pin like him proud men? Men raised to think their will matters more than circumstance. They don't survive failure. Well, he's stronger than you think. I hope you're right. Garrett stood, dropping coins on the bar. I need to get back to my wife. She worries when I'm gone too long. He offered his hand again. Good luck, Reeves. You're going to need it. We'll manage. That's what Custer said. Garrett left. Reeves sat alone at the bar, his whiskey forgotten. Through the window, he could see George walking back from the railway office, shoulders straight despite another day of disappointment. The barkeep leaned across the oak. Your friend there, Garrett, comes in once a week, gets drunk, talks about Little Bighorn, goes home and beats himself up for surviving. Been doing it since July. Some men never leave the battlefield. Reeves said, I left, but I brought the battlefield with me. It's there when I close my eyes. Why you're here. Following some English lord across America instead of home in England. Reeves thought about it. Addington Hall with its empty rooms and unpaid servants. His own room in the servants' quarters, bare except for a cot and a trunk containing everything he owned. The portrait gallery where young George had asked him once what war was like. And Reeves had told him it was organized confusion and came out later in nightmares. I'm here because someone has to be, Reeves said. Lord George is a good man doing something desperate. Desperate men need someone to watch their backs. And who watches yours? Nobody. That's the job. The barkeep poured another whiskey. This one's free. Professional courtesy one soldier to another. I'm not a soldier anymore. Sure you are. You just got different orders now. Reeves drank. The whiskey tasted better free. George entered, bringing cold air and disappointment. He spotted Reeves and crossed to the bar. She was here, George said. 2 days ago. The station clerk remembers selling tickets to 2 women matching their description. They were heading to St. Louis, still 2 days ahead. Yes, George looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his jaw, his clothes wrinkled from days of wear. We need to move faster. We're moving as fast as money allows. Then we need more money. Reeves pulled the wanted poster from his coat. Timber Malone's crude face stared back. The barkeep says Malone hit a stage outside Bloomington 3 days ago. Took a strongbox. Shot the driver in the leg. Local sheriff is organizing a posse, but nobody wants to ride. Malone's got a reputation for killing anyone who tracks him. Where's Bloomington? 30 miles south, wrong direction from St. Louis. George took the poster, studied it. Reeves watched his lord's face, saw the calculation, the desperation, the slow transformation from gentleman to something harder. We go south, George said. We find Malone. We collect the reward. Then we catch the next train to St. Louis with actual money in our pockets. That's sensible. It's desperate. Still the same thing, my lord. George folded the poster. How dangerous is he? Very. The barkeep says he's killed 4 men that people know about. Probably more that nobody talks about. Have you ever tracked a man? I've tracked Zulus through high grass at night. I've tracked game in your father's woods. I've tracked my own fear through 17 hours of combat. I can track one American outlaw. George smiled, tired but genuine. What would I do without you, Reeves? Die, probably. But die with better manners. They left the tavern into late afternoon sun. Springfield spread around them, a town like a dozen others they'd passed through, full of people who never crossed an ocean or tracked a woman or considered hunting a dangerous criminal for money. Reeves, George said as they walked toward the livery stable. My lord, that man you were talking to, Garrett. What did you discuss? War, survival, the difference between dying and living. And what's the difference? Reeves looked at his lord, this young man who inherited failure and was trying to build something from it, who'd crossed an ocean chasing money disguised as marriage, who was about to hunt a killer because he had no other choice. The difference is whether you can live with what you had to do to survive. Reeves said, that's all it ever is. George nodded slowly. They reached the stable, where 2 horses waited, bought with the last of their money, half lame and suspicious, but better than walking. They mounted up. George sat his horse like he'd been born to it, spine straight, hands easy on the reins, every inch the aristocrat even covered in trail dust. South to Bloomington, George said. Then we hunt. Then we hunt. Reeves agreed. They rode out of Springfield as the sun touched the horizon, 2 men moving toward violence because survival required it, carrying their pasts like invisible weight that got heavier with every mile. The sheriff's office in Bloomington smelled like old coffee and gun oil. George pushed through the door. Reeves behind him. A deputy sat at a desk, boots propped up, reading a newspaper with the enthusiasm of a man who'd already memorized every word. Help you? He asked without lowering the paper. We're looking for the sheriff, George said. You found his deputy. That'll have to do. The paper came down. The deputy was young, 25, maybe younger, with red hair and freckles that made him look like someone's nephew pressed into service. His badge was pinned crooked on his vest. We're interested in the Timber Malone reward, George said. The deputy's feet hit the floor. You bounty hunters. We're interested parties. Interested in getting killed, sounds like. He stood, walked to a board covered in wanted posters. Malone's face hung among them, the same crude sketch George had memorized from the train. Malone hit the Quincy stage 3 days ago. Shot driver Pete Morris in the leg. Took a strongbox containing $200. That makes 6 robberies this year. Where does he operate? Reeves asked. Everywhere and nowhere. He hits stages on the Springfield 2 STI, Louis route, then vanishes. We've tracked him to hideouts twice. Both times we arrived to empty camps and cold fires. Man's like smoke. George studied the board. Other faces stared back. Cattle, thieves, horse thieves. A woman wanted for poisoning her husband. The frontier was full of people running from something or toward it. The reward is still valid, George asked. $500, dead or alive. You bring him in breathing. Judge Parker wants to talk to him first. You bring him in dead. Just bring proof, something that proves it's really him. The deputy pulled the poster down, handed it to George. You're really going after him? Yes? What? We need the money. The deputy laughed. Most honest answer I've heard all week. Usually bounty hunters tell me they're redoing it for justice, or because they love hunting, or some other horse manure. You at least admit it's about money. Everything's about money, George said. Not everything. Some things are about stupidity. Hunting Timber Malone solo is definitely stupid. We're not solo. There's 2 of us. 2 of you, against a man who's killed 4 people and probably more. That's still stupid, just less lonely. The deputy returned to his desk, pulled out a map. Here's what I know. Malone's got contacts in every town between here and St. Louis. Railroad workers, stable hands, saloon owners, people who tip him off when something valuable is moving. He's smart, doesn't hit randomly. He waits for big payrolls or bank transfers. George leaned over the map. Towns dotted the route like breadcrumbs: Springfield, Bloomington, Jacksonville, Alton. Dozens of places to hide. Hundreds of people who might know something or nothing. What's his pattern? Reeves asked. Hits stages at river crossings mostly, places where they have to slow down. He works alone, as far as we know. Doesn't leave witnesses if he can help it, but he's not bloodthirsty if you give him what he wants. He takes it and goes. You fight back, you die. Simple. Where was his last confirmed sighting? The deputy tapped the map. Jacksonville. 3 days ago. Bartender at the Red Dog Saloon says a man matching Malone's description drank there, paid in gold coin, which is interesting because the Quincy strongbox contained gold coins. How far is Jacksonville? George asked. 30 miles west. You could ride it in a day if your horses are fresh. George looked at Reeves. Their horses weren't fresh. They were barely alive, bought cheap because cheap was all they could afford. But 30 miles was manageable. What happens if we find him? George asked. The deputy pulled a shotgun from the rack. Check the loads. Set it back. You try to take him alive if possible. Sheriff prefers live prisoners. They can testify. Give up accomplices. Make for better trials. But if it's him or you, shoot first. Nobody's going to question killing Timber Malone in self-defense. We don't have badges. We're not lawmen. Don't need badges for a public bounty. You're citizens performing a civic duty. The deputy grinned. Civic duty that pays $500. George folded the poster and map together. If we bring him in, how do we collect? Bring him here. Sheriff verifies identity. Pays the reward from the county fund. Usually takes a day to process paperwork. You'd have to wait. We can wait. The deputy walked them to the door. Outside, late afternoon was settling into evening. Main Street was quieter. Few wagons, fewer people. Everyone heading home for supper. One more thing, the deputy said. Malone's fast, faster than most men. He's not some drunk cowboy who got lucky robbing stages. He's a professional. You corner him, he won't surrender easy. We'll keep that in mind, George said. No, you won't. You're going to ride out there full of confidence because you've never been shot at. Then you'll discover what it's like when someone's trying to kill you, and you'll either learn real fast or die stupid. Either way, don't say I didn't warn you. They walked to the livery where their horses were stabled. The sun was setting, painting Bloomington in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in this same light, Claudia was moving farther west, putting more distance between them. George's chest tightened. Every day chasing Malone was a day not chasing her. But without money, chasing her was pointless. The Pinkertons wouldn't work for free. Train tickets cost dollars he didn't have. Food, shelter, everything required money. Malone was money. $500 of it. We should rest, Reeves said. Eat, leave at dawn. I want to leave now. The horses need rest, even if you don't. George looked at his valet. Reeves stood patient, as always, waiting for sense to penetrate stubbornness. It was his particular gift knowing when to push and when to wait. You think this is foolish, George said. I think it's necessary. Foolish and necessary aren't mutually exclusive. You've hunted dangerous men before. I've fought dangerous men. That's different. Hunting requires patience. Fighting requires speed. We're going to need both. They found a boarding house that accepted what little money they had left. The room was small, barely space for 2 narrow beds and a washstand. George lay on his bed fully clothed, staring at ceiling boards while Reeves cleaned their pistols by lamplight. My lord, Reeves said after a while. Yes, when we find Malone, if we find him, there's a good chance this goes wrong. You understand that? I understand. I mean truly wrong. Not wrong like losing money at cards or failing to impress at a dinner party. Wrong like someone dies. Possibly us. George sat up. The bed creaked under his weight. I've considered that, have you? Because you've never killed a man, you've hunted game. You've boxed in rings with rules and referees. You've shot targets that don't shoot back. This will be different, I know. Do you? Because knowing intellectually and knowing in your bones are separate things. At Rorke's Drift, I saw men freeze when the Zulus came over the walls. Good men, trained men, who just couldn't pull the trigger when it meant ending a life. They died because they hesitated. George pulled his father's Webley from his coat. The pistol was heavy, worn from use, the grip smooth from his father's hand. He'd watched his father shoot pheasants with this gun. Practice at targets in the estate's shooting range. Clean it carefully every Sunday. His father had never shot a man. I won't hesitate, George said. You don't know that. I do, because everything I care about depends on not hesitating. My mother's home, my family's name, the future I'm trying to build. If I hesitate, I lose all of it. Reeves set down the pistol he was cleaning. That's the wrong reason not to hesitate. What's the right reason? Survival, pure and simple. You don't shoot to save your estate. You shoot because the alternative is dying. When the moment comes, if it comes, you, aren't be thinking about your mother or Addington Hall or anything. Except the man in front of you trying to end your life. That's when you'll discover what you're capable of. George checked the Webley cylinder 6 rounds, brass gleaming in lamplight. He'd fired this pistol hundreds of times. Never at anything that mattered. Tomorrow might be different. Tell me about your first time, George said. Killing someone. Reeves was quiet. He finished cleaning his pistol, loaded it, set it carefully on the nightstand between their beds. Natal, he said finally. Before Rorke's Drift, we were on patrol, encountered a small group of Zulu scouts. Lieutenant ordered us to engage. I fired with everyone else. We dropped 3 of them. I don't know which shots were mine. That was easy anonymous killing, hidden in gunfire. And the first time you knew, Rourke's Drift, Hour 7. A Zulu came over the mealy bag wall right in front of me, close enough to see his face. Younger than me, brave, he had a spear raised, coming down toward my chest. I shot him in the throat. Did you regret it? I regretted that it was necessary. I didn't regret surviving. That's the line you walk, understanding that killing is terrible while accepting that sometimes it's the only option. George nodded. Outside Bloomington was settling into night. Dogs barked. Someone played a fiddle badly. The ordinary sounds of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Tomorrow, he'd ride toward Jacksonville, hunting a man who killed for money. The same thing George was doing. Really, they just had different reasons for it. Get some sleep, my lord, Reeves said. Tomorrow might get complicated. George lay back down. Sleep was impossible. His mind worked through scenarios, finding Malone, confronting him, the moment when talking ended and shooting started. He tried to imagine pulling the trigger, watching a man fall, knowing he'd ended a life. He couldn't imagine it, not really. You never could until it happened. Somewhere in the dark, Reeves' breathing slowed, steadied. The man could sleep anywhere, under any circumstances, another soldier's skill. George watched shadows move on the ceiling, listening to Bloomington breathe around him. Tomorrow he'd discover if he could kill a man, if he could become whatever this country required him to be. The alternative was failure. Return to England, broke and beaten. Watch creditors dismantle Addington Hall, piece by piece, see his mother turned out of her home. No, better to try and die than not try at all. He touched the Webleys' grip, his father's grip, worn smooth by hands that had never killed anything more dangerous than a fox. George wouldn't be like his father, couldn't afford to be. He'd be harder, colder, more practical. Whatever survival required. Dawn came early, pale light through thin curtains. George rose, splashed water on his face, checked his pistol again. Reeves was already awake, sitting on his bed, watching his lord prepare for violence. Ready? Reeves asked. No, George said, but we're going anyway. They collected their horses, rode out of Bloomington toward Jacksonville as the sun climbed behind them, casting long shadows across the road. Somewhere ahead, Timber Malone was drinking or sleeping or counting his stolen gold. George was coming for him, coming for the money that would save everything, coming to discover what kind of man he really was when necessity demanded it. The train rocked. The man across the aisle watched them. He wasn't obvious about it. He pretended to read his newspaper, a Kansas City daily 3 days old, but his eyes kept finding their way over the top of the page. A drummer, Claudia guessed from the worn sample case at his feet. His suit was cheap wool, shiny at the elbows. He had the soft hands of a man who sold things, not a man who made them. Since the incident with the conductor outside Buffalo, every man who looked twice felt like a threat. Claudia pulled the leather-bound journal from her satchel. The paper was cream, the lines faint gray. A gift from her father for her 20th birthday, meant for recording thoughts on European art or Boston society. What was there to write? Day 5 of our escape. The landscape is flat. The food tastes of grease. I am afraid. She looked out the window. Illinois slid past, a brown and green smear under a vast, empty sky. Every town they passed looked tired, the buildings unpainted wood, the faces in the station doorways weathered and grim. There was no romance here, no adventure from the pages of Harper's Weekly, just dirt and distance. The dime novels had lied. They painted the West in bold colors, but out here, the world seemed bleached by the sun. Sarah Chen stirred beside her, a rustle of silk. She had been asleep for the better part of an hour, her botany text resting on her lap. Sarah could sleep anywhere. It was a skill Claudia envied, still staring at that blank page. Sarah's voice was low, husky from sleep. Claudia capped the pen. I was thinking you were worrying. It looks different on you. Sarah sat up, adjusting the pin in her hat. The same pin she'd used on the conductor. Neither of them had mentioned it since, but the memory hung between them. In Boston, you worried about which dress to wear. Out here, you worry about which man is going to follow you between cars. No one is following us. The drummer across the aisle hasn't turned a page in his newspaper since we left Springfield. Claudia's hand went to her reticule, her fingers closing around the cool, heavy gold of her mother's cameo. It felt like the last piece of Boston, the last piece of a life with rules she understood. Here, the rules were unknown. What does he want? Probably nothing. Probably bored. Sarah peered out the window. But probably isn't a guarantee. Not anymore. She turned from the window, her dark eyes sharp. This is what you wanted, isn't it? Freedom. The word sounded hollow. I wanted a choice. You made one. This is the result. Sarah's tone wasn't unkind, just factual. She was a scientist's daughter. She dealt in facts. My father has business associates in St. Louis, a shipping magnate. He owes my father a favor. I sent a wire from Springfield. He'll have a carriage waiting for us. And he's booked us rooms at the planter's house, under the name Mrs. Gable and daughter. Claudia looked at her friend. You did all that without telling me. You were busy worrying. Sarah pulled a small, silver flask from her bag. She uncapped it, took a quick sip, and offered it to Claudia. The faint scent of brandy cut through the coal smoke in the car. We needed a plan beyond just running. St. Louis is a real city, bigger than Boston, easier to get lost in, harder to be found. Claudia waved the flask away. He won't follow us to St. Louis. Lord George, I mean, he'll have given up by now. Gone back to England with his pride. Men like that don't have pride, Sarah said. They have ledgers. You're an asset in one of his columns. He won't give up until the account is settled. The train's whistle shrieked, long and mournful. Ahead, the sky was darkening. Another town, another stop, another set of staring faces on a wooden platform. Claudia tucked the journal away, the page still blank. The drummer across the aisle folded his newspaper. He set it on the seat beside him, then stood, stretching his arms. He was taller than she'd thought, broad in the shoulders. He picked up his sample case, not to leave, but to place it in the overhead rack. Then he turned, his gaze direct. He took the 2 steps across the aisle and stood over them. Pardon the intrusion, ladies. His voice was smooth, practiced. Couldn't help but notice you're traveling alone. Headed for St. Louis. Sarah's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her hat. Claudia found her voice. We are. He gave them a salesman's smile, all teeth and no warmth. It's a rough town. Rivermen, gamblers, all sorts. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. A word of advice. Don't talk to strangers. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked down the aisle toward the dining car, leaving his sample case above his empty seat. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Well, that was helpful. Claudia watched the man disappear. He'd left his case. He was coming back. She looked at the empty seat, then at the endless darkening plains outside the window. They were still moving west, but for the first time, she felt like she was standing perfectly still, waiting for something to find her. The steamboat landing at St. Louis was a machine that chewed up men and spat out cargo. The air, thick with the smell of river, mud, and coal smoke, tasted of rust. Men with shoulders like barrels rolled hogsheads of tobacco and whiskey down splintered gangplanks, their curses a rhythm under the groan of steam whistles. George stood at the edge of the chaos, his English boots sinking into mud that seemed determined to pull them off. Reeves, a step behind, held there to warn cases, his gaze sweeping the levee, cataloging threats. They had walked from the rail depot, a journey of a dozen blocks that felt like crossing into another country. Boston was brick and order. Chicago was smoke and ambition. This was something else entirely. This was muscle and noise. We need a place to stay, Reeves said, his voice pitched just above the din. Then we ask questions. George nodded, his eyes fixed on a saloon built from rough-hewn timber. It signed the Riverman's Rest swinging on one hinge. Men spilled from its doors, their faces hard from sun and cheap whiskey. We ask questions there. A man who serves drinks hears everything. He started toward it, picking a path through stacks of cotton bales and coils of rope, thick as a man's arm. A trio of dock workers blocked his way, their faces slick with sweat. The one in the center was big, a red beard fanning across a chest that strained the buttons of his wool shirt. He watched George approach, a slow grin spreading across his face. Look what the high tide washed in, the big man said. His voice was a gravelly rumble. You lost, friend. George stopped. I'm looking for information. The man's grin widened. He nudged the man beside him. He's looking for information. He mimicked George's precise vowels, stretching the word into an insult. What sort of information you looking for? Mary Poppins. 2 women, George said, his face a mask. Traveling together. One English, one of Chinese descent. They would have arrived from the east a few days ago. The dockworker spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed a foot from George's boots. Chinese, you say? The only Chinese girls I seen around here are in the cribs up on Almond Street. Maybe your friend got tired of traveling. Reeves shifted his weight, the leather on the cases creaking. George gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture so small only Reeves would see it. They are ladies, George said. They would have sought passage on a riverboat, perhaps up the Missouri. Ladies, the big man laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He took a step forward, crowding George, close enough that George could smell the stale beer on his breath. You don't look like you know much about ladies. You look like you know about tea parties. He poked a thick finger into George's chest. The poke was light, a test. Now, why don't you and your butler float on back to whatever puddle you came from? George did not move back. He looked at the man's finger, then at his face. Remove your hand. The man's eyes widened in mock surprise. Or what? He shoved George, a solid, jarring impact meant to send him stumbling back into the mud, but George didn't stumble. He rode the push, letting his weight shift to his back foot, and then he moved. It wasn't a brawl, it was geometry. His left hand shot out, not as a fist, but open, the heel of his palm striking the base of the man's nose. I sound like a wet branch snapping. The man's head jerked back, his eyes watering. Before the man's hands could come up, George stepped in, his right fist traveling no more than 6 inches, a short, sharp cross that connected with the man's jaw. The big man's legs gave out. He did not fall so much as collapse, folding into the mud like a discarded coat. The other 2 dock workers froze, their mouths open. No one had seen a punch thrown. They had seen a man standing, and then that same man on the ground. George stood over him, breathing evenly, his hands already uncurled at his sides. He looked at the other 2 men. "I am still looking for information." They backed away, hands raised, and disappeared into the crowd. The collective noise of the levee, which had quieted for a moment, resumed its roar. But a space had cleared around them. Men still watched, but from a distance. George turned and walked toward the Riverman's Rest. Reeves followed. Inside, the saloon was dark and smelled of sawdust. The bartender, a man with a shaved head and an apron stained with things George didn't want to name, had watched the whole thing from the doorway. He was wiping the bar with a gray rag as they approached. "That was something," the bartender said. He set the rag down. "Figured a man dressed like you would holler for the coppers. I find directness saves time," George said. He laid $1 on the scarred oak whiskey, "For both of us, and information." The bartender poured 2 glasses. He pushed them across the bar and left the $1 where it was. "Saw 2 women like you described, 2 days ago. The Chinese girl was quiet, but the other one, the English one, she did the talking. Booked passage on a packet boat. The Far West heading up the Missouri." George drank. The whiskey was raw, but it cut through the taste of the river. "How far up?" "Didn't say." The bartender leaned on the bar. "But the Far West only makes 2 stops this time of year. Jefferson City, and then all the way to Fort Benton, in Montana Territory." He looked George up and down. "That's a long way from a tea party." George put his glass down. Montana Territory. The name sounded like the end of the world. He looked at the $50 he had left from the Malone reward. It wouldn't be enough. Not nearly. He'd need more. Men in silk vests spoke in low tones in the lobby, their conversations smelling of cigar smoke and money. It was a world Claudia understood, a language of quiet luxury she had been raised to speak. The familiarity of it felt like a betrayal. After 2 weeks of iron benches and the constant threat of grime, comfort felt unearned. Sarah's father's associate, a man named Elias Sinclair, met them in a private parlor. He had the soft, uncalloused hands of a man who moved money, not freight, and a waistcoat that strained across his middle. He bowed to them, a gesture that was more assessment than courtesy. "Miss Chen," he said, his eyes on Sarah, "your father's telegram was most explicit. You are to be afforded every comfort and protection." He turned his gaze to Claudia, and his smile tightened. "And you must be the young lady accompanying her." "My name is Claudia Ashworth," Claudia said. Sinclair's smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course. For the hotel register, however, you are Mrs. Gable and her daughter, Helen. Discretion is a valuable commodity in this city." He placed a thick envelope on the mahogany table between them. "Your father has arranged a line of credit for you, Miss Chen. This should suffice for your immediate needs. New clothes, passage further west, should you choose." "We choose," Sarah said, taking the envelope. "We intend to join a wagon train to Santa Fe." Sinclair raised an eyebrow. "Santa Fe? That is a long and perilous journey. The Comanche are restless this season." He made it sound like a social inconvenience, like a ball being postponed due to rain. "This is not Boston. The West is no place for ladies traveling without a proper escort. We have managed thus far," Claudia said. "You have been lucky," Sinclair corrected, his voice smooth. "Luck is not a reliable business partner." He stood, the interview clearly over. "Should you require anything further, you may send a note to my office. But I would advise you to book passage back east. The world is a dangerous place for those without a position in it." He left them in the silent, airless room. Sarah opened the envelope. It was filled with banknotes, crisp, new, smelling of ink. "He is insufferable," Claudia said. "He is useful," Sarah replied, counting the bills. She tucked the money into her reticule. "First, we buy clothes that don't scream Eastern Society runaway." The room was a cavern of white linen and gleaming silver. Claudia ordered without looking at the menu, her mind still on Sinclair's warning. Their voices were low, but the acoustics of the grand room carried their words. "Took the whole payroll. 2,000 in gold coin," one man said, swirling brandy in his glass. "The Pinkertons will get him," said another. "They always do." A third man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The Pinkertons are in Chicago. Malone is here. He's hitting stages between here and Jefferson City. A man can't even ship his profits safely." The name caught Claudia's ear. Malone. She remembered the deputy in Bloomington. They say he killed a driver outside Bloomington, the first man said. Shot him for a $200 strongbox. The reward's up to $500 now. The third man said, $500 to clear the road. Seems cheap. Claudia put down her fork. The men were not speaking of justice. They spoke of a man's life, of murder and theft, as if discussing freight costs or the price of beef. It was a business transaction. Timber Malone was a problem to be solved, and $500 was the fee. The dime novels had never mentioned that. They wrote of brave lawmen and daring outlaws, of right and wrong. They never mentioned the cold calculus of the ledger. Did you hear that? She whispered to Sarah. Sarah nodded, her eyes on the men. Every man in this city is a businessman, Claudia, even the outlaws. They just have a different definition of commerce. The men at the other table paid their bill and left, their voices fading into the general murmur of the dining room. Claudia watched them go. They were the men her father did business with, men who built railroads and ran stockyards and moved money across a continent. And they spoke of a man's death as a necessary expense. She looked at the plate of food in front of her, suddenly, without appetite. The luxury of the hotel, the crisp banknotes in Sarah's bag, the casual brutality of the cattleman's conversation, it was all connected. Sinclair was right. This was not Boston. She had run from a world where she was a commodity, only to find herself in a world where everything, and everyone, had a price. The gambler's den was a long, narrow room called the Gilded Cage, though nothing in it was gilded. The air was a fog of cheap cigar smoke and sweat, thick enough to taste. Kerosene lamps hung from the low ceiling, casting a yellow, greasy light on the faces of men hunched over tables. The only sounds were the soft riffle of cards and the clink of poker chips, a language of greed and hope that needed no translation. George sat at a small table in the corner, a glass of rye in front of him. He had made the whiskey last an hour. Reeves stood by the wall near the door, a sentinel in the gloom. His presence a quiet statement that went unnoticed until it was needed. They had $43 left. A ticket up the Missouri to Jefferson City would cost 10, horses, another 20. That left $13 for food, ammunition, and whatever trouble lay between here and a man named Timber Malone. George was not watching the cards. He was watching the men. He listened to the low, clipped conversations, the arguments that started and died without ever rising above a murmur. He was looking for the crack in the wall, the loose tongue, the man whose losses made him loud. He found him at the center table. The man was a riverboat pilot. Judging by his blistered hands and the confident set of his shoulders, now slumped in defeat. He had lost 3 hands in a row. His pile of chips had dwindled to a few desperate stacks. Another card, the pilot said, his voice rough. He slid his last chips into the pot. The dealer, a man with eyes like chips of slate, dealt the card. The pilot flipped it over. A 3 of clubs. The man across the table showed his hand, a quiet flush of hearts. He raked in the pot without a word. The pilot shoved his chair back. House is crooked. The dealer did not look up. The cards fall where they fall. Friend, you want to buy back in? With what? The pilot stood, swaying. You cleaned me out. He looked around the table, his gaze settling on the winner, who was stacking chips with practiced calm. You got the devil's own luck. The winner shrugged. Luck's got nothing to do with it. That's what Malone says. The pilot slurred, gesturing with an empty hand. Timber, Malone. He makes his own luck. The room went quiet for a beat. The name hung in the smoky air. Men glanced at the pilot, then away, their faces blank. Nobody wanted to be part of this conversation. The dealer spoke, his voice soft. You know Malone, drank with him, the pilot bragged, his confidence returning. Right here in this room, last week, he bought a round for the whole table, paid in gold coin. He laughed. Said the railroad was a generous employer. George's hand tightened on his glass. He caught Reeves' eye. This was it. Malone's a ghost. Someone at another table muttered. Sheriff's posse can't find him, because they're looking in the wrong place, the pilot said, louder now, playing to the room. They're checking the rail lines, the stagecoach depots. Malone's smarter than that. He's holed up where no one thinks to look. The dealer stood. Friend, I think you've had enough for one night. The pilot's face flushed with anger. You throwing me out. I'm suggesting you get some air. The pilot kicked his chair, the sound loud in the tense quiet. He turned and stormed toward the door, shoving past men who melted out of his way. George stood. He left his half-finished rye on the table and followed. Reeves fell into step behind him. They found the pilot in the alley, leaning against a brick wall, slick with damp. The noise of the levee was a distant roar. He was fumbling with a pouch of tobacco, spilling more than he got into his pipe. George stepped out of the shadows. A word. The pilot looked up, startled. He recognized George from the saloon. What do you want? You mentioned Timber Malone. George said. You said you drank with him. The pilot's eyes narrowed. Who's asking? A man with a business proposition. George took out 2 of his remaining dollars. He held them where the light from the street could catch them. I have a disagreement with the railroad myself. A man like Malone could be a useful partner. The pilot stared at the money, then at George's face. "You don't look like an outlaw. Appearances can be deceiving," George said. "You said he was smart, that he was hiding where no one thinks to look. Where is that?" The man hesitated, a flicker of caution in his drunken eyes. Reeves took a single, silent step forward, the movement just enough to draw the pilot's attention. The alley seemed to get smaller. "He's got a line cabin," the pilot said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "West of Jefferson City, near a place called Coulter's Creek. There's an old oak tree on the ridge above it, split clean in two by lightning. The cabin's in the hollow below that. He said a man could see the whole world from that ridge, and the whole world would never see him." George placed the $2 in the man's hand. "This is for the drink you couldn't afford." The pilot curled his fingers around the coins. "You go looking for Malone. You're a fool. He'll kill you as soon as look at you." "I'll take my chances," George said. He turned and walked back toward the street. Reeves was beside him. They didn't speak until they were clear of the alley, back in the yellow gaslight of the St. Louis night. "Coulter's Creek," George said. The name was a destination, a target. Reeves looked at the money George had left. "We have $11. My lord, then we will have to make it enough." The Jefferson City boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. 4 men sat around the common room table under the weak yellow glow of a single kerosene lamp. Dinner had been a watery stew, and now the men lingered, reluctant to retreat to their cold, narrow rooms. There was Silas, a retired riverman with hands like oak pearls, a young farmhand named Caleb who looked barely old enough to shave, and a drummer selling patent medicine, his sample case tucked under his chair like a loyal dog. Reeves sat apart from them, at a small table by the window, cleaning his Martini Henry rifle. The lamplight caught the scarred wood of the stock and the oiled gleam of the action. He worked with a quiet, practiced economy, each movement precise. He laid a clean cloth on the table and began to disassemble the bolt. "That's a big gun for a valet," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks rolling downstream. Reeves did not look up. "It is a service rifle. An old friend. You see service?" Then the drummer asked, leaning forward. He had the easy curiosity of a man who made his living asking questions. "I did." Reeves used a small brush to clean the extractor claw. Caleb, the farmhand, stared at the faint white line that traced Reeves' jaw. "Is that where you got that scar?" Reeves paused. He touched the scar, a reflexive gesture. "Yes." "Indians?" Caleb asked, his voice full of prairie dread. "Zulus," Reeves said. The room went quiet. Silas set his tin cup down with a soft click. The Zulus were a distant, almost mythical threat, a name from newspaper stories about a savage war in a land none of them could picture. "South Africa," Silas said, narrowing his eyes. "Read about that little place. Rorke's Drift." Reeves met the riverman's gaze. He stopped his work and began to reassemble the rifle's bolt, the metal parts clicking together with clean precision. "You read the papers." "The papers said it was a massacre." The drummer said 4,000 of them savages came down on 100 of you. 139 of us. To be precise, Reeves corrected, his voice flat. "And some men from the colonial contingent, the numbers change depending on who tells the story." The Zulus never stopped to count. He told them then, not because he wanted to, but because their expectant silence demanded it. He spoke in a low monotone, his eyes on his work, as if narrating a diagram. He told them of the mission station, the makeshift hospital. He told them of the wall. "We had no stone, no timber to speak of. The lieutenant had us use mealie bags, corn sacks, and biscuit boxes from the commissary." Caleb's brow furrowed. "You built a wall out of biscuit boxes." "We did," Reeves said. "They kept coming over it. We'd bayonet them, and they'd fall back, and their brothers would use the bodies to climb higher. We ran low on ammunition for the rifles. The quartermaster started handing out rounds for the pistols. Men were fighting with bayonets and bare hands by the end of the first hour." He described the hospital catching fire. The fight from room to room through smoke and flame, dragging wounded men from their beds while the thatch roof collapsed. He did not speak of courage or glory. He spoke of the heat, the thirst, the deafening noise that became a kind of silence, the 17 hours of it. When he finished, no one spoke. The drummer stared into his empty cup. Caleb looked pale. Silas picked up his pipe and began to pack it with slow, deliberate movements. "And you're callin' that English stick, you work for your lord?" Silas finally asked, his thumb pressing tobacco into the bowl. Reeves slid the bolt back into the rifle. The action was smooth, perfect. "He is Lord William George, the 5th Earl of Addington." "Yes, he looked like he's ever seen a fight?" Silas asked, striking a match. The sulfur flared, lighting his weathered face. "Or does he just pay you to do his fighting for him?" Reeves stood. He picked up the rifle. It felt balanced in his hands, an extension of his arm. He looked at Silas, then at the other men watching him, their faces lit by the single lamp in the quiet room. "Is he good in a fight?" Silas pressed. Reeves considered the question. He thought of George in the St. Louis mud, the quick, brutal efficiency of his fists. He thought of the cold calculation in his eyes when he decided to hunt Malone. He thought of the boy in the library, weeping in silence, refusing to break. "Better than me," Reeves said. He turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving the three men sitting in a cloud of pipe smoke and a silence deeper than before. The room in the Kansas boarding house was small and square. A single window looked out onto a street that was mostly dust, and beyond it, a flat, brown world that went on forever. Wind rattled the loose pane, a sound like a dry whisper. A fine layer of grit covered the windowsill, the wash basin, the patched quilt on the bed. Claudia stood at the window, one hand resting on the frame, watching nothing. Sarah sat on the edge of her cot, mending a tear in her traveling skirt. She worked with small, neat stitches, her needle a glint of silver in the gray afternoon light. She did not look up when she spoke. "Your father will forgive you." Claudia did not turn. "Forgive me for what?" "Wanting a life." "For leaving," Sarah said. "Men like your father forgive anything that can be settled with money or an apology. It's tidier than a feud. This isn't about him." Sarah bit the thread, her movements sharp. "No, who is it about, then?" "This grand adventure into the West." She looked around the small, grim room. "Is this what you read about in Harper's Weekly?" "We're free," Claudia said. The word sounded thin against the moan of the wind. "Are we?" Sarah set the skirt aside. She looked at Claudia's back, at the stiff line of her shoulders. "My father has worse to forgive me for than running away. He has to forgive me for being born." Claudia turned from the window. Sarah's face was calm, her hands resting in her lap. There was no self-pity in her voice, only the flat weight of fact. "That's not true," Claudia said, "isn't it? In Boston, I was the railroad magnate's half-Chinese oddity, a curiosity for your father's friends to whisper about over brandy. Here," she gestured toward the window, toward the endless brown land. "Here, what am I? Just the Chinese girl. Something less. Something to be stared at or grabbed at in a train car. We're getting away from all of that." "To where, Claudia?" "To what?" Sarah stood and walked to the window. Standing beside her friend, she looked out at the empty street. "You talk of freedom. What does that word mean when you have no money and no name? Free to do what? Teach school in a sod house for $15 a month, until the school board decides they'd rather have a man. Become a seamstress in some dusty town, going blind in bad light for 10 cents a shirt." "We have money," Claudia said, her voice quiet. "I have money," Sarah corrected. "My father's money. A line of credit he extended because he'd rather I was a scandal 1,000 miles away than one in his own city. We are living on my shame, Claudia. That is not freedom. It is a longer leash." Claudia stared at her friend. The dime novels she'd read, the romantic fantasies of the frontier she had clung to, they all evaporated in the face of Sarah's cold, hard words. The heroines of those stories were always penniless and alone, yet they triumphed. They never had a friend with a father's bankroll quietly smoothing the path ahead. "You have an education and you have access to my money," Sarah continued, her voice low and intense. "Most women out here have neither. They have a husband who might be a good man or a drunk who beats them. They have children to feed and a winter coming on. That is their reality. Our reality is that we are playing at being pioneers, and the game is getting dangerous." Claudia turned back to the window. The vast prairie no longer looked like a promise. It looked empty, an enormous vacant space that could swallow a person whole. The wind pressed against the glass, a relentless, indifferent force. She had run from a cage made of silk and expectations, but she had not found freedom. She had only found a bigger cage, one made of dust and sky. The poker game was in the back room of the Overland Hotel, a place with flocked wallpaper and clean glasses. It was a step up from the gamblers' dens. The men here had wallets thick with cattle, money, and railroad script. They played 5-card draw, no limit, and drank whiskey that didn't come from a shared barrel. George had turned their last $11 into 30, then 50, then 90. He did it by playing 3 hands an hour, folding on anything that wasn't a near certainty, and letting the others bleed money on bluffs and bad odds. Reeves stood by the door, a shadow in a room full of lamplit faces. He watched the men, not the cards. The man George was winning from was a rancher named McLeod. He was a bull of a man, with a red face and a voice that filled the room. He played poker the way he probably ran his ranch, with loud confidence and big, clumsy bets that scared smaller men out of the pot. He had been winning until George sat down. "Raise," McLeod said, shoving a stack of chips into the center of the table. "Let's see who's got sand." The other 3 players looked at their cards, then at McLeod's stack, and folded one by one. The pot was between the rancher and George. George looked at his hand. He held 3 aces. He had drawn 2 cards. The odds of McLeod holding something better were long. George counted out chips and matched the bet. Call McLeod showed his hand. 2 pairs, kings, and 8s. He grunted when George laid down his 3 aces. The dealer pushed the pot toward George. It was another $20. He had over 90 now. Enough for horses that wouldn't die on the trail. Enough for a week's food. McLeod stared at George, his good humor gone. "You play a tight game, Englishman. I play the cards I am dealt." George said. Do you now? McLeod leaned forward, his bulk straining the chair. I say you play like a clerk, counting pennies. No heart for the game. George stacked his chips. He did not look at the rancher. He waited for the next deal. The silence in the room stretched. The dealer began to shuffle. McLeod held up a hand. Hold on. Every eye went to him. One hand, McLeod said, his voice a challenge. You and me. Double or nothing. George stopped stacking his chips. He looked at the pile in front of him. $94. The result of 6 hours of grinding. Patient play. Double that was almost $200. Pinkerton money. You're 94 against 94 of mine, McLeod said. Winner take all. Show this room if you're a gambler or just a bookkeeper. George felt the old heat rise in his throat. The familiar ghost of his father's pride. The sting of the insult. He could feel the eyes of the other players on him, waiting. The dealer looked at George. Your call, sir. George picked up his cards. He fanned them open slowly, keeping them low. A pair of jacks, another pair, sevens. He had drawn one card. It was a third jack, a full house, jacks over sevens. It was a beautiful hand, a hand a man could bet his future on. He looked across the table at McLeod's face, red and challenging. He could take this man's money. He could humiliate him. From the corner of the room, by the door, came a single, soft cough. It was not loud. It was barely a sound at all, just a dry clearing of the throat. But it cut through the silence like a gunshot. Reeves their signal. It did not mean the other man was cheating. It meant the situation was turning. It meant the risk was no longer just the money on the table. George looked at McLeod again. He saw the fury in the man's eyes, the humiliation of being beaten by a man he considered his inferior. Reeves was right. Winning this hand could be more dangerous than losing it. McLeod was not a man who would take the loss with grace. He was a man who might wait in an alley with his friends. George held the full house in his hand, a winning hand. He thought of his father, who never walked away from a challenge and died with nothing. He laid his cards face down on the table. Fold. The room exhaled. McLeod stared, incredulous. You fold. On a single bet. I do, George said. He began to gather his $94 in chips. McLeod laughed, a loud booming sound. No sand at all. I knew it. An English bookkeeper, afraid to play a real hand. He threw his own cards down in triumph. He had two pairs, the same kings and eights as before. George stood. He pushed his chair in. He nodded to the dealer. Thank you for the game. Gentlemen, he walked to the cashier, Reeves falling in behind him. He exchanged the chips for cash. $94. It felt heavier than the gold he'd lost selling his father's watch. They walked out of the hotel, into the cold night air. The street was empty. They did not speak until they were a block away. The sound of McLeod's laughter a faint echo behind them. Pride's expensive, my lord, Reeves murmured. George nodded, his hands in his pockets, clutching the roll of bills. But not as expensive as a funeral. The $94 bought them 2 horses that could walk all day, and a man who knew the land between Jefferson City and the river. The man's name was Pike. He was built of leather and wire, with a face the sun had cracked into a permanent squint. He looked at the money George counted into his hand, then at George's tailored trousers and clean boots. You want Malone, Pike said. It was not a question. The bounty's $500. My cut is 20%. I get you to his camp. What you do when we get there is your business. That is the arrangement, George said. These boots ain't made for riding, Pike observed, his gaze dropping to George's feet. They are the boots I have. Pike spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust of the livery yard. Your funeral. They rode west out of the city, leaving the noise and the mud behind for a rolling landscape of scrub oak and dry grass. Pike rode ahead, a small, dark figure against the enormous sky. Reeves rode beside George, his posture relaxed, his movements in sync with the rhythm of his horse. George rode like a man sitting on a mess post. He had been taught to ride on groomed English parkland, on horses trained for posture and procession. This was different. The western saddle was a foreign country. It demanded a looseness in the hips he did not possess. Every jarring step of the horse sent a shock up his spine. Pike did not look back. He set a steady pace, one that 8 miles without killing the animals. The sun climbed. Dust rose from the trail, coating George's throat, settling on the fine wool of his coat. After 3 hours, the pain started. A dull ache in his thighs and lower back. After 4, it was a fire. He gritted his teeth and focused on Pike's back. A fixed point in a world of swaying horizons and constant, grinding motion. They stopped at noon by a shallow creek. Pike and Reeves dismounted with fluid ease. George swung his leg over the saddle and nearly fell. His legs would not hold him. He gripped the saddle horn, his knuckles white, and waited for the feeling to return. Pike watched him from under the brim of his hat. He said nothing. He watered his horse, then produced a wedge of hard cheese and a knife from his saddlebag. Reeves came to George's side. My lord, I am fine. George's voice was hoarse. He forced his legs to move, walking stiffly to the creek's edge. He knelt and splashed water on his face. The cold shock was a brief mercy. They ate in silence. The cheese was sharp, the hardtack tasteless. When they finished, Pike stood. "We ride till sundown," he said. The afternoon was worse than the morning. The sun was hotter, the dust was thicker. The fire in George's legs now had teeth. He felt the rough denim of his borrowed riding trousers chafed his inner thighs, rubbing the skin raw with every step of the horse. He kept his back straight. He did not complain. Late in the day, as the sun began to bleed orange across the horizon, Pike reined in his horse and turned to look at them. "We make camp here." George dismounted. This time, he did not stumble. The pain was a clean, sharp thing. He could walk through it. He began to unsaddle his horse, his movements clumsy but deliberate, copying what he saw Reeves and Pike do. Pike walked over. He was not looking at George's face. He was looking at his legs. George followed his gaze. Dark stains had blossomed on the inside of his trousers. High on the thigh, blood. The chafing had worn through the fabric and the skin beneath. Pike's expression did not change. He looked from the bloodstains to George's face. He saw the exhaustion there, the pain held tight behind the eyes. He saw a man who had ridden 8 hours in agony and had not uttered a single word of complaint. Pike pulled a small tin from his saddlebag. He tossed it to George. "Gris," Pike said, "put it on, or you won't be walking tomorrow, let alone riding." He turned and began to gather wood for a fire, leaving George standing there with the tin of foul-smelling lard in his hand. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the vast, empty world went purple and then dark. The telegraph office in Santa Fe was a small adobe room that smelled of dust and ozone. A line of men stood at the counter, miners and merchants, a cavalry sergeant sending a report. Claudia waited her turn, feeling the impatience of the men behind her like a physical pressure. When she finally reached the window, the clerk slid a single yellow envelope toward her without looking up. Her name was written on the front in a precise, blocky script. She took it outside into the brutal, white sunlight of the plaza. The air was thin and dry. She leaned against a sun-warmed wall, away from the flow of people, and tore the envelope open. The message was printed on a thin strip of paper, the letters stark and black. "Father, gravely ill. Doctors fear the worst. Return at once. H. Ashworth." She read the words once, then a second time. The paper trembled in her hand. The plaza, with its market stalls and mule-drawn carts, seemed to recede, the sounds of life turning into a distant hum. Her father, gravely ill. The words were a stone dropping into a deep well. She felt the pull of it, the cold shock. Her first instinct was a lurch of guilt, so sharp it took her breath away. To be 1,000 miles away while her father was on his deathbed. Then, a second thought, cold and sharp as the first, rose to meet it. He was a liar. He had lied to her about business deals, about dinner guests, about the reason they had to sell her mother's favorite horse. He lied with the ease of a man who believed the truth was simply a tool, to be used or discarded as needed. This was a tool, a lever to pry her out of her freedom and put her back in her cage. Sarah found her there a few minutes later, a statue against an adobe wall, the yellow paper clutched in her fist. "Claudia, what is it?" Claudia did not look at her. She watched a group of children chase a stray dog across the plaza, their laughter sharp in the clear air. "A message from my father. What does he want?" "He wants me to come home." Sarah waited. When Claudia did not continue, she spoke again, her voice gentle. "Why?" Claudia held out the paper. Sarah took it, her eyes scanning the brief, brutal message. She folded it carefully and handed it back. "Do you believe him?" Sarah asked. Claudia finally looked at her friend. She saw the question in Sarah's eyes, the quiet weighing of possibilities. This was not a simple question. It was the whole question. If she believed him, she had to go back. Duty demanded it. Love, what was left of it, demanded it. And if she went back, she would never leave again. The cage door would shut for good. If she did not believe him, she had to be prepared to be wrong. To live with the knowledge that her father might have died alone, calling her name, while she was chasing a fantasy of freedom across a desert. Her face, which had gone soft with the first shock of the news, began to change. The uncertainty in her eyes cooled into something harder. The soft line of her mouth firmed. She was her father's daughter. She knew the value of a well-timed lie. "No," Claudia said. The word was quiet, but it had the weight of a vow. "He is a master of the timely crisis," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "An illness when a contract is due. A financial scare when an investment sours. He is dying the way a chess player sacrifices a pawn. To get his queen back." She crumpled the telegram in her fist. The paper made a dry, rustling sound. "I'm not going back," Claudia said. She looked out at the sun-drenched plaza, at the distant, hazy mountains that ringed the valley. Not yet. Dawn came gray over the ridge, a slow bleed of light that touched the tops of the scrub oaks and left the hollow below in deep shadow. They lay on their bellies in the dirt, the ground cold through their clothes. Below them, a small fire cracked, a single point of orange in the gloom. The smell of coffee and wood smoke drifted up to them on the still air. Pike pressed his face to the eyepiece of a small brass spyglass. He grunted. "That's him." the one by the fire. Same broken nose from the poster. George watched the camp. 3 men. One was Malone, a big man hunched over a tin cup. Another was younger, tending to the horses. The third lay wrapped in a blanket near the fire, a lump in the darkness. The camp was tucked into a box canyon, sheltered on 3 sides by rock walls. One way in, one way out. It was a good hideout if you weren't expecting company from above. "They're positioned poorly," Reeves murmured, his voice a low rumble beside George. "No sentry. Too confident. They think they're ghosts," Pike said, collapsing the spyglass. 3 men, all armed. "We wait." "Wait for what?" George asked. His voice was tight. The cold from the ground had seeped into his bones. "For the marshal. I sent word from Jefferson City. He'll be here with a posse by tomorrow noon, maybe sooner." George looked at the camp again. He saw the horses, saddled and ready. He saw the men drinking their coffee, slow and lazy, like men with no appointments to keep. By tomorrow noon, they would be gone. The camp would be ashes and cold tracks leading in a dozen different directions. "They will scatter," George said. "Maybe," Pike conceded. "Maybe not. It's the smart play. We got the high ground and the sun at our backs when it rises. We got the numbers. If the marshal shows, if he shows," George repeated. He pulled his father's Webley from his coat. The pistol was heavy, a solid weight in his hand. The metal was cold from the night air. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. He had 50 more in his saddlebag. He had $50 left for expenses. A day's wait was a day's food, a day's lodging. A day he could not afford. "We take them now," George said. Pike turned his head slowly, his squint fixed on George. "You listen to me, Englishman. That ain't just some drunk cowboy down there. That's Timber Malone. He will kill you without a thought. His partners too. We wait for the law. The law is a day away. The reward is right there." George gestured with his chin toward the camp below. "I was hired to guide you, not get you killed. You were hired for a percentage of the bounty." George corrected him. "There is no bounty if he is gone." Pike spat into the dirt. 20% of nothing is still nothing." George looked at Reeves. His valet met his gaze, his face calm, unreadable. He had pulled his own rifle, an old Martini Henry he'd kept from his army days. He laid it on the rock in front of him and began to wipe the breech with an oiled cloth. His movements were slow, precise. The actions of a man preparing for a job of work. He did not offer an opinion. He did not need to. George turned back to Pike. "We are not waiting." "You're a fool," Pike said, his voice flat. "A high-toned fool who's going to get us all shot." "Perhaps," George said. He tucked the Webley back into his belt, leaving the handle exposed. "But I will be a fool with $500. He did not wait for Pike to argue further. He did not wait for Reeves to finish cleaning his rifle. He pushed himself up into a low crouch, his eyes fixed on the camp below, and began to move. He slid over the edge of the ridge, his boots dislodging a small cascade of dirt and pebbles that skittered down into the darkness. The skitter of pebbles was the only warning. Down in the camp, the young man by the horses looked up from his work. His head cocked, he saw the shadow detaching itself from the ridgeline, a man moving fast down the slope. He dropped the currycomb and lunged for the rifle, leaning against a saddle. Malone was on his feet, the tin cup thrown aside, his hand already on the butt of the Colt holstered at his hip. George hit the flat ground of the canyon floor, his legs absorbing the shock. He did not stop. He walked forward into the firelight, the Webley in his hand. "Timber Malone," George said. His voice was steady, carrying in the cold air. "There is a bounty for you in Jefferson City." The young man had the rifle now. He swung the barrel toward George. Gunfire answered him, but it did not come from George. A heavy boom echoed from the ridge, a sound that cracked the morning silence. The young man spun, a hole appearing in his shoulder, the rifle clattering on the rocks. He went down without a sound. The third man, the lump in the blanket, was up. He had a pistol in his hand, and he fired it twice, the shots wild and loud. A second boom from the ridge. The man folded at the waist, grabbing his leg, and toppled back into his blankets. The world was noise and smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Malone had not moved. He stood by the fire, his face a mask of disbelief in the flickering light. He looked at his 2 men on the ground. He looked at George, a dark figure advancing from the shadows. Then he looked up at the ridge, where the rifle smoke hung in the air. He was a professional. He knew a trap when he saw one. He did not draw his gun. He turned and ran. He moved with a speed that defied his size, scrambling toward the back of the box canyon, toward a narrow gap in the rock, choked with scrub oak. George did not hesitate. He did not look at the wounded men. He did not wait for Reeves or Pike. He saw his $500 running away, and he gave chase. His long legs ate the ground. The fire in his thighs from the ride was a distant memory, burned away by a clean, hot adrenaline. Branches whipped his face, tearing at his coat. His lungs burned. He could hear Malone crashing through the brush. Ahead of him, a big man making a lot of noise. The ground sloped away sharply. A ravine. Malone plunged into it, sliding on the loose rock, trying to keep his feet. George did not slow. He launched himself forward in a desperate, sprawling lunge. He hit Malone's back with his full weight. The impact sent them both over the edge. They tumbled down into the darkness of the ravine, a tangle of limbs and curses, crashing through thorny brush and over sharp rocks until they hit the bottom with a force that knocked the air from both their bodies. The saloon in Jefferson City was loud with the business of men who had finished their day's work. George sat at a table by himself in the corner, nursing a beer, his back to the wall. He was writing in a small notebook he had purchased at the general store, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not look like a man who had just won a gunfight and a small fortune. He looked like a clerk tallying accounts. Reeves and Pike sat at the bar, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses between them. Pike poured the amber liquid, catching the light from the oil lamps. He pushed a glass toward Reeves. "He's a strange one, your lord," Pike said, his voice low. Reeves looked at George's back. "He has his ways. I've seen men come into money before. They drink, they find a woman. They talk loud. He just sits and writes." Pike took a drink of his whiskey. "I figured him for a tenderfoot rich boy playing cowboy. I was wrong. Many people are," Reeves said. He did not touch his glass. Pike swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the way the light moved through it. "You've known him long. Since he was a boy, and you just follow him. He says ride, you ride. He says fight, you fight. Why?" Pike looked at Reeves, his eyes direct. "It ain't just the money. I saw you on that ridge. You were ready to start a war for him." Reeves was silent for a long moment. He watched George turn a page in his notebook. He thought of another notebook, a much larger one, a ledger bound in worn leather. "His father, the old Earl, was a good man," Reeves said finally, "but he was a dreamer. He made investments in railways that were never built, in mines that held nothing but rock. He trusted the wrong men. When he died, the estate was ruined. The creditors were at the door." Pike nodded. He understood ruin. "Lord George was 13, Reeves continued, his voice quiet, almost lost in the noise of the saloon. "I found him one night in the library. The house was cold. We could only afford to heat a few rooms. He had the estate ledgers open on his father's desk. The desk was so large he had to stand on a stool to see the top of the pages." Reeves picked up his glass. He looked at the whiskey but did not drink. He was trying to make sense of the numbers, trying to find a way out. He had ink on his cheek. He had been crying, but he had done it silently, so none of the household staff would hear him. "When he saw me, he wiped his face with his sleeve and stood up straight. He asked me if I knew how to calculate compound interest on a loan." Pike stared into his glass. The noise of the saloon seemed to fade away. "He stood there all night," Reeves said, "working through those books while the house grew colder. I brought him a blanket. He never used it. In the morning, he had a list of every asset that could be sold, every cost that could be cut. He was 13 years old, and he was trying to hold his world together with ink and paper." Reeves finally took a drink. The whiskey was smooth. "Some men are born to their titles, Mr. Pike," he said, setting the glass down with a soft click. "Others earn them. Lord George has done both." Pike finished his own drink in one swallow. He looked over at the corner table, at the Englishman with his torn coat and his split knuckles, writing in his little book as if the world depended on it. Pike's expression had changed. The curiosity was gone. In its place was a hard, clear look of respect. "Yeah," Pike said, his voice a low rasp. "I reckon he has." The saloon in Jefferson City was loud with the business of men who had finished their day's work. George sat at a table by himself in the corner, nursing a beer, his back to the wall. He was writing in a small notebook he had purchased at the general store, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not look like a man who had just won a gunfight and a small fortune. He looked like a clerk tallying accounts. Reeves and Pike sat at the bar, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses between them. Pike poured the amber liquid, catching the light from the oil lamps. He pushed a glass toward Reeves. "He's a strange one, your lord," Pike said, his voice low. Reeves looked at George's back. "He has his ways. I've seen men come into money before. They drink, they find a woman. They talk loud. He just sits and writes." Pike took a drink of his whiskey. "I figured him for a tenderfoot rich boy playing cowboy. I was wrong. Many people are," Reeves said. He did not touch his glass. Pike swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the way the light moved through it. "You've known him long. Since he was a boy, and you just follow him. He says ride, you ride. He says fight, you fight. Why?" Pike looked at Reeves, his eyes direct. "It ain't just the money. I saw you on that ridge. You were ready to start a war for him." Reeves was silent for a long moment. He watched George turn a page in his notebook. He thought of another notebook, a much larger one, a ledger bound in worn leather. "His father, the old Earl, was a good man," Reeves said finally, "but he was a dreamer. He made investments in railways that were never built, in mines that held nothing but rock. He trusted the wrong men. When he died, the estate was ruined. The creditors were at the door." Pike nodded. He understood ruin. "Lord George was 13, Reeves continued, his voice quiet, almost lost in the noise of the saloon. I found him one night in the library. The house was cold. We could only afford to heat a few rooms. He had the estate ledgers open on his father's desk. The desk was so large he had to stand on a stool to see the top of the pages. Reeves picked up his glass. He looked at the whiskey but did not drink. He was trying to make sense of the numbers, trying to find a way out. He had ink on his cheek. He had been crying, but he had done it silently, so none of the household staff would hear him. When he saw me, he wiped his face with his sleeve and stood up straight. He asked me if I knew how to calculate compound interest on a loan. Pike stared into his glass. The noise of the saloon seemed to fade away. He stood there all night, Reeves said, working through those books while the house grew colder. I brought him a blanket. He never used it. In the morning, he had a list of every asset that could be sold, every cost that could be cut. He was 13 years old, and he was trying to hold his world together with ink and paper. Reeves finally took a drink. The whiskey was smooth. Some men are born to their titles, Mr. Pike, he said, setting the glass down with a soft click. Others earn them. Lord George has done both. Pike finished his own drink in one swallow. He looked over at the corner table, at the Englishman with his torn coat and his split knuckles, writing in his little book as if the world depended on it. Pike's expression had changed. The curiosity was gone. In its place was a hard, clear look of respect. Yeah, Pike said, his voice a low rasp. I reckon he has. The man who came to their boarding house room was not a postman. He wore a string tie and a wool coat that was too hot for Santa Fe even in the morning. He smelled of ledger ink and starch. He knocked once, a dry rap of knuckles on pine, and waited. Sarah opened the door a crack. Yes, a private correspondence for Miss Claudia Ashworth. The man said. He held up a thick envelope, forwarded twice. The original Boston postmark was nearly obscured by a stamp from St. Louis. From the offices of Ashworth & Sons, he delivered the envelope and a look that managed to convey both professional discretion and deep disapproval. Then he tipped his hat and was gone, his polished shoes clicking down the hall. Claudia took the envelope. It felt heavy. It was not from her father. She knew his handwriting. This was the precise, sterile script of a clerk. She broke the seal with her thumbnail and pulled out a single folded sheet. It was not a letter, it was a report. She read it standing by the window, the high desert sun pouring into the small room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah watched her, saw her friend's expression shift from curiosity to disbelief. Then Claudia laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was sharp and sudden, a bark of pure astonishment that caught in her throat. She leaned against the window frame for support, the paper trembling in her hand. The laughter came again, louder this time, spilling out of her, echoing in the quiet room. It was the sound of a carefully constructed world, shattering into pieces. Claudia, Sarah said. What is it? Claudia could not answer. She slid down the wall to the floor, still laughing, her shoulders shaking. She laughed until the sound broke, until it cracked into a sob, and then she was crying, her face buried in her hands, the report lying on the dusty floorboards beside her. Sarah knelt and picked up the paper. She smoothed the creases and read. From the desk of Alan Pinkerton, Western Division, October 4, 1876, report to client H. Ashworth, Boston RE. Subject, Lord William George, 5th Earl of Addington. Subject arrived Jefferson City, Missouri, October 2nd. Subject was accompanied by valet, one Reeves, and a local tracker named Pike. Subject was in pursuit of the wanted outlaw Jack Timber Malone. An engagement occurred on the morning of October 3rd at a hideout in the Ozark foothills. 2 of Malone's associates were wounded. Malone was apprehended by Subject after a foot chase and physical altercation. Subject delivered Malone to the marshal in Jefferson City and collected the $500 bounty. Subject then proceeded to the local branch of Ashworth & Sons and wired the bulk of the funds to an account in England. Subject retained $50 for expenses and was last seen purchasing supplies for westward travel. Sarah read it twice. She looked at the words physical altercation, $500 bounty, $50 for expenses. She looked at Claudia, who was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her breathing still ragged. He's not supposed to be good at this, Claudia whispered. He's supposed to be drinking tea and complaining about the colonies. Sarah folded the report. He sounds persistent. Claudia looked up, her eyes red. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Persistent. Sarah, an Earl of the British Empire, tackled a man into a ravine for $500. She shook her head, a fresh wave of hysterical laughter threatening to break through. He's not persistent. She pushed herself to her feet and went back to the window. She stared out at the adobe buildings, at the mountains that ringed the town like a fortress wall, at a world she had only read about in magazines, a world that was harder and stranger than she had ever imagined. She took the paper from Sarah's hand and crumpled it into a tight ball. He sounds desperate, Claudia said, her voice barely a whisper. Like me. They saw the dust first, a yellow plume rising against a sky the color of faded denim. It came from the south, a moving smudge that resolved itself slowly into a line of riders. Reeves pulled his horse to a halt. He unslung the Martini Henry from his saddle and rested it across his lap. George stopped beside him, his hand resting on the grip of the Webley tucked into his belt. They waited. The riders wore blue. A cavalry patrol, a dozen of them, their uniforms coated in the fine red dust of the trail. They rode with the weary slump of men who had been in the saddle too long. A young lieutenant with a bright yellow chevron on his sleeve broke from the formation and trotted toward them. He pulled up a few feet away, his horse dancing nervously. "That's far enough," the lieutenant said. His face was sunburned, his mustache a failed attempt at authority. He was too young for the command. "We have no quarrel with the United States Army," George said. His voice was calm, his accent sharp and clear in the dry air. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. He took in George's torn but well-cut coat, the English saddle, the straight-backed posture that seemed to defy the heat and the dust. He looked at Reeves, at the old model rifle, and the scar that cut a white line across his jaw. "State your names and your business," the lieutenant said. "I am Lord George of Addington. This is my valet, Mr. Reeves. We are traveling to Santa Fe on a personal matter." The lieutenant almost smiled. "A lord." In the middle of New Mexico territory, he spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed near George's horse. The horse shied. George controlled it with a quiet hand. "You're a long way from home. The road to Santa Fe is open, is it not?" George asked. "The road is open," the lieutenant said. "But what's on it is the question. We're advising travelers to wait for an armed escort. A band of mescalero jumped the mail stage south of here last week, near Diablo Canyon." George's posture did not change, but Reeves saw his knuckles go white on the reins. "Was the stage carrying passengers?" George's voice was steady. "Too steady, a few," the lieutenant said. He seemed to enjoy holding the information. "A drummer from St. Louis and 2 women. Easterners." From the sound of it, the sun beat down. The air was still. George's face was a mask of stone. "And what became of the women?" he asked. "The driver and the drummer are dead," the lieutenant said, his voice flat with the casual brutality of his trade. "The Apaches took the women and the mail." Reeves felt the world tighten to a single point. He watched his lord, saw the almost imperceptible tensing of the muscles in his jaw. "You left them," George said. It was not a question. It was an indictment. The lieutenant's face flushed with anger. "We tracked them for 2 days. They crossed into the Dragoon Mountains. That's Chiricahua land. My orders do not extend to starting a war with Cochise's ghost." He shifted in his saddle. "Besides, it's over. A trader out of Fort Sumner, a man named Sinclair, heard about it. He deals with the mescalero, rode into their camp 2 days ago with a wagon of goods. He ransomed them back." George leaned forward in his saddle. The movement was slight, but it was electric with a sudden, coiled violence. "They are alive." "Far as I know," the lieutenant shrugged. "Sinclair brought them to his trading post yesterday. It's a day's ride from here, if you push it. Now I'll thank you, to turn back and wait for the supply train in a few days." He did not wait for an answer. He wheeled his horse and trotted back to his patrol. The column of blue-coated riders moved on, their dust rising behind them until they were once again a smudge on the horizon. George stared after them. He looked at the empty trail, at the vast, indifferent landscape that stretched before him. He thought of Claudia's letter, of her fierce desire for a freedom she did not understand. He had sent her into this. His pursuit had pushed her deeper into a world that would kill her without a thought. The bounty, the chase, the honor of his name, it all turned to ash in his mouth. He made a sound, a low noise of strangled fury. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks. The animal grunted in surprise and lunged forward, breaking into a desperate gallop. Reeves watched him go. He saw the frantic, punishing pace, the reckless posture of a man running from something he could not outrun. It was no longer a pursuit, it was a flight. Lord George rode as if the demons of every decision he had ever made were snapping at his heels. Reeves raised his own reins, his face grim. He knew the look. The horse was blowing blood from its nostrils. George did not slow. He rode the animal into the ground, a frantic punishment for the miles and the guilt. The sun hammered his shoulders. The landscape was a blur of rock and thorn, a red desert that cared nothing for his urgency. Reeves followed 10 yards back, a grim shadow pacing his lord's descent into madness. He did not call out, there was nothing to say. They rode through the afternoon and into the long, purple shadows of dusk. The horse, under George, stumbled, caught itself, then stumbled again. It went to its knees, pitching George over its head into the dust. He rolled and came up coughing, the taste of alkali in his mouth. The horse lay on its side, its chest heaving and ragged. Final breaths. Reeves dismounted. He walked over to his lord, who stood staring at the dying animal. George's face was a mask of dust and sweat. "We walk from here," Reeves said. George did not look at him. He pulled the Webley from his belt. The shot was a flat crack in the immense silence of the desert. The horse shuddered once and was still. George holstered the pistol and started walking. They walked for an hour. Then they saw a light, a single yellow spark against the encroaching darkness. Sinclair's trading post. It was not a fort. It was a low-slung adobe building with a sagging porch and a corral holding a half-dozen horses. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. George stopped at the edge of the light spilling from the open doorway. He could hear the murmur of voices from inside, the clink of a glass. He wiped the dust from his face with his sleeve. He straightened the torn lapels of his coat. He was no longer the frantic rider. He was an earl, preparing for an audience. Then he saw her. She sat on a bench under the overhang of the porch, just outside the square of light. A second woman sat beside her, her head resting on the first one's shoulder, Claudia. Her dress was ripped at the sleeve. A crude bandage of white cloth was wrapped around her wrist. She was staring out into the darkness, toward the mountains, as if she could see something there that no one else could. George's breath caught in his chest. The air, the dust, the ache in his legs, it all vanished. There was only the woman on the bench, a still figure in the twilight. Sarah, the woman beside her, stirred and lifted her head. She saw them first. Her eyes widened. She touched Claudia's arm. Claudia turned her head slowly. Her gaze swept across the dark yard and found him. She did not gasp. She did not move. She simply froze, her eyes locking with his, across the 30 yards of packed dirt that separated them. In her eyes he saw not fear, but a deep, bottomless exhaustion. He saw a woman who had run as far as she could and had found only a harder cage at the end of it. He took a step. She flinched. A small involuntary movement. He stopped. He stood for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. He let her see him not as a pursuer, not as a lord, but as a man covered in the same dust as her, his fine clothes ruined, his face burned by the same sun. He removed his hat. He walked toward her then. He did not hurry. His steps were measured, quiet on the hard ground. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at anything but Claudia. He approached as if she were a deer he had startled at a watering hole, a creature that would bolt at any sudden sound. He stopped 10 feet from the bench, close enough to see the dark smudges of fatigue under her eyes, far enough to give her air. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was a dry rasp. He cleared his throat. "I am William George." Her chin lifted. The movement was slow, deliberate. It was the only part of her that seemed to have any fight left in it. "Should we talk?" she asked. George inclined his head toward the open door of the trading post. Inside might be better. Claudia looked at the square of yellow light, then back at him. She gave a small, weary nod. Sarah rose with her, a silent guard, and followed them into the main room of the post. The place smelled of dust, cured leather, and coffee. Lanterns hung from the low ceiling beams, casting long shadows that hid the corners of the room. A long counter ran down one wall, stacked with bolts of cloth and tins of goods. In the center of the floor stood a single table, its surface a geography of knife scars and dark stains. Reeves was already there, speaking in low tones to a man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much. The man nodded and moved toward the back of the building, leaving them. Claudia sat at the table. Sarah took the chair beside her. George waited until they were seated before taking the one opposite. Reeves remained standing by the door, a sentinel at his post. The silence stretched. George rested his hands on the tabletop. Claudia's eyes fixed on them. They were not the hands she had imagined. The nails were short, one of them cracked. The knuckles were scraped raw, and a thin white scar ran across the back of his right hand. They were the hands of a man who had worked and fought. "My father's detectives are quite thorough," she said. The words were quiet, brittle. "They are," George said, "but they are not the reason I am here. No, you crossed a continent. You hunted a man for money. I imagine you did not do it for the pleasure of my company." "I did it because I was broke," he said. There was no apology in his voice. It was a simple statement of fact. "And because I gave my word, your word, to my father. Not to me." "That is a fine distinction," George said. "But it does not change the reality of the situation." He leaned forward slightly. The lantern light caught the hard planes of his face, a face burned by the sun and stripped of softness. "I require your family's financial support to save my mother and what is left of my estate. That is the truth of it. No romance, no pretense. It is a business arrangement that your father proposed, and mine, before he died, accepted in principle." He paused, letting the bluntness of the words settle in the space between them. "And you," he continued, his voice softer now, his gaze falling to the bandage on her wrist. "You require freedom from a forced marriage. You have made that abundantly clear." Claudia's chin came up. "So you have come all this way to tell me you agree with me, that I should be free." "I have come all this way to find a solution," he said, "because the current path benefits neither of us. You run, and your father's reputation suffers. He will not forgive that easily, and I fail, and my family is ruined." "That sounds like your problem," she said. "It is," he agreed, "but your freedom is yours. We each hold something the other needs. Perhaps," he said, spreading his calloused hands on the scarred wood of the table, "we can negotiate terms that we both can bear. Claudia stared at him. She had expected a dandy, a lord full of pronouncements and entitlement. She had prepared herself for threats, for commands, for pleas to her sense of duty. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for a man who looked her in the eye and spoke of her freedom as a commodity, as real and as valuable as his own need. He was not the man from the letters, not the figure in her father's plans. He was something else entirely, something harder and more direct, something real. She looked from his face to his hands, then back to his eyes. They were gray, the color of the sea in winter, and they held no judgment, only a deep, weary pragmatism that mirrored her own. "What sort of terms?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Claudia did not answer him. She pushed her chair back from the table, the legs scraping against the packed dirt floor. The sound was loud in the quiet room. She looked at Sarah, a silent question in her eyes. A moment, Sarah said to George. Her voice was level, a counterpoint to the tension at the table. She stood and took Claudia's arm, leading her toward the door. George watched them go. He did not speak. He simply sat, his scarred hands resting on the table. A man who had laid his cards down and now had to wait for the other player to make a move. Reeves shifted his weight by the door, his eyes following the women outside. The night air was cool, a relief after the stuffy warmth of the trading post. A sliver of moon hung in a black sky littered with stars. The desert was not silent. It was alive with the hum of insects, the distant yip of a coyote. Claudia walked to the edge of the porch and leaned against a rough-hewn post. She wrapped her arms around herself. "He is not what I imagined," she said. Sarah stood beside her. "No, he's not." They looked out at the corral. A single lantern hung from a pole, casting a circle of soft light. In it, George and Reeves moved with a quiet efficiency. George had taken off his ruined coat. In his shirt sleeves, he looked leaner, harder. He was speaking to the trader Sinclair, who gestured toward a roan mare. George ran a hand down the horse's leg, checking for swelling. He moved with a practiced confidence, the way a man does who knows his business. He offered to bargain, Claudia said, like he was buying cotton futures. He was, Sarah said. "You, me, his mother, his house, it's all stock to be traded." She paused. "My father would understand him perfectly." Claudia turned to look at her friend. "And you think that is a compliment?" "I think it is a fact," Sarah said. "Men like my father, men like yours, they see the world as a ledger, debts and assets. This man, this lord, he understands that ledger. He didn't come in here quoting poetry or pleading for your honor. He came in here and stated his position. He assessed your position, and he proposed a merger." From the corral, they heard Reeves' low voice, then George's answer, crisp and clear. They were haggling with Sinclair over the price of the horse, their voices calm, reasonable, the voices of men conducting business. "He hunted men," Claudia said, her voice a whisper. "He killed someone. He survived," Sarah corrected her. "He did what he had to do to keep moving. He didn't do it because he enjoyed it. He did it because he had no other choice. There is a difference." She leaned against the post, next to Claudia. "He crossed this entire country. He arrived with nothing. And instead of giving up, he turned himself into what this country required him to be. A man who works, a man who fights." Sarah's gaze was fixed on the two men by the corral. "My father has business partners from China, old men with long memories. They have a saying for a man like that. A man who holds to his word, who does not posture, who is exactly what he appears to be, even when what he appears to be is unpleasant." "What did they call him?" Claudia asked. "Who?" Sarah said softly. "Jade, but not the fancy carved kind. The raw kind. The kind you find in a riverbed covered in mud. Valuable not for what it looks like, but for what it is. Unbreakable." Claudia watched as George shook hands with Sinclair. The deal was done. He turned then, and his eyes found her across the yard. He did not smile. He did not gesture. He simply looked at her, his face half in shadow, his expression unreadable. He was not a hero from her dime novels. He was not a suitor from a Boston ballroom. He was a man who had sold his father's watch to buy a map, who had slept in filth, who had faced a killer in a dry creek bed, all to get to this table in this dusty outpost to bargain for his survival. He was not what she had imagined. He was something far more dangerous. He was real. Claudia pushed away from the porch post and walked back inside. Sarah followed a step behind. The air in the trading post felt thick, weighted with the things that had not yet been said. George was at the table, his coat slung over the back of his chair. He had a cup of coffee in his hands, the steam rising into the lantern light. He looked up as they entered. Claudia sat. She did not look at him immediately. She looked at the table, at the geography of scars in the wood. She traced one with her finger. "You spoke of terms," she said. George set his cup down. The sound was a soft click in the quiet room. "I did." He did not elaborate. He waited. He made her ask. It was a small thing, a shift in the balance of power. She was no longer just a quarry. She was a party to the negotiation. "What are they?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "A truce," he said. For 3 months, he let the words hang in the air. You wanted to see the West, the real West, not the one in the magazines. You are seeing it now. It is not a place for a woman to travel unprotected. I have Sarah, she said. You have a hat pin and a friend. He corrected her, his voice without judgment. I have a rifle, a valet who fought Zulus, and $500 that says I can handle myself when things get difficult. He gestured to the room around them. You have seen what can happen. I am offering my protection. And Mr. Reeves, in exchange for what? Claudia asked. My signature on a marriage license at the end of it. In exchange for your time, he said. We traveled together. For 3 months. We continue west, we see this country. You learn what you came here to learn, and he paused. I learned what I need to, and at the end of 3 months, this was the heart of it, the point on which everything turned. George leaned forward. The lantern light carved his face into sharp angles of light and shadow. At the end of 3 months, you make your choice, he said. If you still wish to refuse the marriage, you will tell me, and I will write to your father. I will tell him that I am the one who is declining the arrangement, that I find you unsuitable. I will break the contract. Sarah, who had been silent, drew in a sharp breath. Claudia stared at George. She had not expected this. It was a move of shocking strategic grace. He was offering her a shield. He would take the public failure, the social disgrace, upon himself. She would be free to return to Boston, not as a runaway, but as a woman who had been wronged, her reputation intact. And you, she said, her voice low, you will lose everything. He held her gaze. In his eyes, she saw the long, hard road from Boston. She saw the empty rooms of his English house, the portraits of his ancestors watching from the walls. She saw the crushing weight of the duty he carried. I will have tried, he said, with honor. My father lost his fortune, but he never broke his word. I will not break mine to you, or to him. He leaned back, the negotiation finished on his part. That is something. Claudia looked down at her hands, resting on the scarred table. Freedom. She had run 1,000 miles in search of it, and she had found it here, in a dusty room at the edge of nowhere, offered to her by the one man she thought was its greatest threat. But it was a different kind of freedom now. Not the boundless romantic notion from her books, but something harder, more complex. A choice, bought and paid for. She thought of the mescalero, of the long, terrifying days, of the look in the lieutenant's eyes when he spoke of her as a ransomed commodity. George was right. This was not a place to be alone. She looked at Sarah, who gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then she looked at George. He was watching her, his expression patient, his gray eyes revealing nothing. The unbreakable man, the piece of raw jade. She stood. He stood with her. She extended her hand across the table. 3 months, Lord George, she said. He took her hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. It was not the soft hand of a drawing-room aristocrat. It was the hand of the man he had become. The handshake was not an act of surrender. It was the signing of a treaty. Dawn broke, cold and sharp, the light washing over the desert in shades of pale rose and gray. Inside the trading post, the treaty held. The air, once thick with tension, was now thin with a different kind of quiet. The quiet of preparation. Reeves moved with the economy of a man who had packed for 100 campaigns. He checked their supplies, what was left of the jerky and hardtack, the state of the canteens. Sarah stood by the counter, watching Sinclair weigh out coffee beans and flour into canvas sacks. She paid him from a small leather purse, her movements precise. An investment in the new venture. Outside, George stood with the roan mare he'd bought from Sinclair. He ran his hands over the animal, speaking to it in a low murmur. Claudia watched him from the porch. He had not slept. She could see it in the lines around his eyes. He had spent the night by the corral, a silent watchman. He finished with the horse and turned to a crude map spread on a barrelhead. He traced a line west with his finger, toward the Arizona border. There's a man, he said to Reeves, who had joined him. Name of Silas Kane, wanted for robbing a U.S. Army payroll wagon near Fort Defiance. The bounty is $1,000. Reeves looked at the map. That's Apache country. The money is there, George said. It was not a debate. It was the new reality. He folded the map. His eyes found Claudia on the porch. He gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement of her presence. Nothing more. She walked down the steps, the dust soft under her boots. She stopped a few feet from him. He smelled of trail dust, of horse, and of the coffee he'd drunk by the fire. That pistol, she said, her gaze on the Webley holstered at his hip. My father has a matched pair in his study. He uses them for target practice on Sundays. I know, she said. I want you to teach me. He did not seem surprised. He looked at her, his gray eyes assessing. He saw not the woman who had run from Boston, but the one who had survived the mescalero. It is not a toy, Miss Ashworth. I am aware, she said. I have seen what happens to toys in this country. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave another of his small, decisive nods. When we make camp tonight, I'll show you. An hour later, they were ready. for riders, for horses. Sinclair stood on his porch to watch them go, a small, permanent fixture in a vast, moving landscape. Reeves mounted his horse, the Martini Henry in its saddle scabbard. Sarah, her face set with a look of cool resolve, climbed onto her mare. George swung into his saddle, his movements fluid, economical. He looked at Claudia. She gathered her reins and mounted, her back straight. She settled into the saddle and looked west, toward the empty horizon. The sun was behind them, casting their shadows long and thin across the desert floor. George's profile was a hard line against the morning light. He was not the man from the portrait her father had shown her. That man was a ghost, a creature of soft English light and inherited privilege. This man had been remade by the hard sun and empty spaces of the country he now rode through. He was leaner, he was harder, he was more real. The road to Fort Defiance is not an easy one, he said, his voice carrying in the clean air. Claudia looked at him. She thought of the letter she had left in Boston, the one that had started all this. "I need freedom," she had written. She had thought freedom was a destination, a place you could ride to, like Santa Fe. She was beginning to understand it was not a place at all. It was the road itself. She spurred her horse forward, falling into place beside him. She was not afraid. For the first time in a long time, she was not running from what lay behind her. She was curious, with a sharp and sudden hunger, to see where this road would lead.